Welcome back, everyone. I know it's been a few days, but we're here now, and we're going to be discussing my thoughts on the Big Ten in the future and why I'm buying stock in them, along with talking about some bold predictions, just different position groups across the sport of college football. Bit of a interesting, weirder show today, but things have been well. I appreciate you guys checking in the live chat. I am doing pretty well today. Just went live about an hour later because I didn't feel as prepared as I wanted to be. But we're here now. And before we begin, I encourage all of you, if you haven't already, to like the show, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and also hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when we go live. We'll be talking about some interesting things tomorrow and Friday in relationship to some of the how do I put this? In relationship to some of the best games in college football, among other things. So stay tuned for that. Before we start, actually, I'm gonna change my setup here. There's something not right. So I will be right back. This should only take like a minute or two. Much better. I was just getting a little bit too hot. It's pretty hot in Michigan today. High 80s, high humidity. It feels pretty humid in my house. So I just wanted to close the blinds and then turn the fan my way so I wouldn't be sweating during the stream. Otherwise, it would be harder to concentrate. But welcome and thank you for coming in. Thank you for stopping by. And I think the perfect place to start off this show is by discussing one of the final teams that I thought was appropriate to include in the Big Ten title conversation, and that being Penn State. I want to take a little bit of a deeper look into whether or not Penn State can win the Big Ten in 2026. And let me know in the live chat if you think they can. They have a win total of 9.5 in the preseason. They are 6th in odds to win the Big Ten, tied for 19th in odds to win it all. They're projected to be a pretty good team this year, but to win the Big Ten would require them to do pretty well in the regular season and also to be power rated at a much higher level than I think a lot of people would power rate them at right now, myself included. Can Penn State win the Big Ten in 2026? That's the question that we're asking today. The Nittany Lions last year were among one of the favorites to win the Big Ten, along with Ohio State and Oregon. Instead, they go 6-6, finish in the bottom half of the conference in terms of record. And while they were power rated top 15 or top 20, depending on where you look, their record did not reflect that at all, and they had to flush James Franklin and the previous regime out. Matt Campbell and a lot of his staff and roster from Iowa State and some players and coaches from other schools come into Happy Valley. And now the question is whether or not Penn State can get back to their winning ways. Because for as many flaws as James Franklin had, you have got to admit that he at least did a good job of putting Penn State in a conversation for the 4-team playoff pretty much every year, and also put them in a conversation where if they followed his usual trend, which is, go 10-2, lose to Ohio State, lose to any other big teams you play that's either 9-3, 10-2, or 11-1, depending on the schedule, you get a team that is going to be in the 12-team playoff most seasons. And look, I've defended Franklin being fired by Penn State. I've defended Penn State for making that decision because a blue blood school should expect to win a big game more often than once every decade. They just should. The idea that Penn State should be content with being Ohio State's, basically, for lack of a better term, punching bag is lunacy. They should not be content with that. That's not how it should be. But you do take a risk by trading in a high floor and a very low ceiling for a product in Matt Campbell, who has never had a head coaching job in the Big Ten, who's never quite had circumstances like this. It's a new move. It's something new. With something new comes risks. I happen to think that this is a good hire, and from what I can tell, I would think the books agree with me. When you look at how they're 6th in Big Ten title odds despite losing as much as they did. They had nearly double-digit NFL draft picks on their roster, and if you include players who transferred to other schools and will start and one day get drafted, or you include some younger underclassmen who played well enough to likely be drafted in the future, such as Darius Dixon, you're looking at most of last season's starting lineup outside of a receiver getting drafted somewhere by some team in some round. And that speaks to Franklin's process of being, I would say, a good developer and good evaluator of talent and constructing teams that, if things went a little bit differently, could have done more. But we saw with a large enough sample size, was just never able to get it done. So can Penn State get it done this year with a schedule that is among one of their easier ones in recent memory, because Ohio State's not on the schedule, Oregon's not on the schedule, Indiana is not on the schedule. USC and Michigan, who are tied for 4th in winning the Big Ten, are the toughest games in the schedule, along with a road trip to Washington late in the season. Marshall, at Temple, Buffalo, Wisconsin, at Northwestern are the first 5 games of this schedule. Penn State will be favored in all of those games. In 4 of them, they'll probably be favored by double digits. USC at home will be a close spread. Michigan on the road could be a close spread. Off the bye, they'll be favored over Purdue, probably be a small underdog to Washington on the road, and be favored over Minnesota, Rutgers, and Maryland. This team's win total, there is a reason why it is at that 8.5, 9.5 level. And that is because of the schedule that they have, on top of the fact that they are expected to be a good team this year. Great team, we'll see. They'll have to be a great team to win the Big Ten. But to get to Indy, they could just be a good team and win some close games and go 11-1, 10-2. Just for context, as this was a recent change, and I didn't quite notice it until today, but I do trust my graphic designers enough to, when they make a change for a win total or a time of kickoff, I trust it. Penn State's win total now is 8.5. It's heavily juiced to the over, but it is no longer 9.5. And I do agree with that, as you could see in my Big Ten predictions video. The link to that is down in the pinned comment. I do think that Penn State's probably going to be an 8-4, 9-3 team, but we have to talk about hypotheticals here and the what if. We're not talking about what I think Penn State will be. We're asking if they have the necessary ceiling to win the Big Ten in 2026. And last season, if things had maybe panned out differently, they did. But it was such a disaster from a head coach angle, from a, matching what Knowles and Kotelnicki wanted to do with what was needed to be done, with what Franklin wanted to do, or what he thought was needed to be done. The whole thing was a mess, and that's the last we'll talk about 2025. But enough core pieces from last year's team come back, and enough core pieces from Iowa State come in, where I think it's fair to say that this Penn State team projects to probably be similar to last year's Penn State team. Little bit of a lower upside in terms of roster, but I would say a higher upside in terms of coaching acumen, alignment. There won't be the same type of pressure on this team that there was with last season's team. And I think for Penn State, they can get to Indianapolis because so much of getting to Indy and so much of winning the Big Ten too is schedule related. But I think with a team like Penn State as well, you have to consider that getting to Indy is going to be very different than winning in Indy, because whoever Penn State would hypothetically play in Indianapolis is probably going to be much tougher than anyone they've played on their schedule. I think that Indiana and Oregon, Ohio State, all of whom Penn State avoid, will be a touchdown or better than anyone Penn State plays on their schedule, at the very least. And some of those schools could be double-digit favorites on a neutral field over all those schools that Penn State plays. It's an easy schedule, and that can help you get to where you want to be, but it's also not going to be a great proving grounds or training grounds for what you might want to do when you get where you want to be. This offense last year was, I would say, looked more like the Penn State offense that we were expecting at the beginning of the year. At the start of the year, it was pretty bad. The defense had some really nice pieces on it last year, and at the end of the day, I think much of the failures of Penn State's players last season were the team and the roster and really the university viewed that Oregon game as more of a coronation than a tough contest they would have to win, and their will to fight and their will to follow Franklin, and I think Franklin's will to coach there, broke after that Oregon loss, and the team quit, really. There was still tremendous talent there. I mean, Darius Dixon played phenomenally as a true freshman. You got to see Cooper Cousins and Anthony Dunco play on an offensive line that at times really flashed high upside. Andrew Repellier played well. Kobe Howard had some flashes as well. And we didn't get to see much of the young running backs or much of the quarterback position in terms of, players who are going to play for Penn State this season. But Rocco Becht transfers in, and he's had success at Iowa State. Caleb Bacon transfers in at linebacker, probably my favorite transfer addition for Penn State from Iowa State. And Tony Rojas returns, and I think Rojas, when healthy, is an All-American caliber player. And Zion Tracy returns as well at defensive back. So there are good pieces from what was a good team last year that come back, and those are pieces who could have been great and could have played on a great team if not for the chaos that ensued after that Oregon loss. Penn State's special teams unit was among the nation's best last season, and they do return kicker Ryan Barker. So that is a good sign for this team as well, especially if they are going to need to win some close competitive contests. When you look at the Big Ten returning production rankings here, something that I don't think is necessarily encouraging is how low Penn State is. They were so senior-laden last year, and they were so old, veteran, but also I think so attached and all in on Franklin in a way that booting him out in combination with that old roster where Penn State this season was going to have low returning production anyway, even if things panned out, resulted in a total roster turnover. I mean, Penn State, I think, has around 50 new players on its roster, maybe even 60 or 70. There is so much newness to this team. And really, you're going to see it in 24/7 Sports 2026 Team Talent Composite. The talent level of this team is going to drop off by quite a bit next year in terms of blue chip ratio. The question is, how much will that matter? Because we've seen at Iowa State them field good teams that are power rated highly even, and certainly teams that have good records and overachieve relative to their power ratings, because Campbell's a good coach and is widely respected in coaching circles, from at one point the NFL taking interest in him, Penn State taking interest in him. Reportedly the Michigan job was his dream job, and I can imagine in a different universe he ends up getting that. He's a good coach, and I believe that he is a better game manager and a better game day coach strongly than Franklin is. You have to be. You have to be better than Franklin in that department if you have that much sustained success at Iowa State, go to 2 Big 12 title games, win a New Year's Six Bowl. I know that was in the COVID year. Have a double-digit win season there. You have to be. And when I look at Penn State this season, one thing where they could be different than prior Franklin teams, especially the 2020 Franklin teams, is they could have a competent group of pass catchers with a confident quarterback. One thing that I didn't like about Aller clearly a more talented quarterback than Sean Clifford. It never really felt like he was able to rip it and really become aggressive and confident until he was under all the pressure in the world. And then, only then, if the coaching staff allowed it. So Oregon in the Big Ten title game, when at times Oregon led by double digits, then you unleash the beast. Or think about USC that same season when they were down by 2 scores. Yeah, then they unleash him. In every other contest, it never really felt like they unleashed him or he was able to step up and make the have it play. And I think he's more talented, way more talented than Becht, but Becht has that confidence about him where he knows that he can put a team on his back and he can make a game-changing play. So while the talent level on offense, I don't believe is going to be dramatically better. In fact, look, at running back on the O-line, I believe it will be clearly worse. And Iowa State has some underrated receivers and better receivers than Penn State had last season. I don't think they're dramatically more talented. I think the key here is that Penn State will have a clearer identity at the coaching level and also the player level. And one thing that really hurt Franklin at Penn State and what caused him to underutilize talent at times is, especially on offense, it felt like they were trying to mimic schools such as Ohio State or other top programs without having the talent necessary to perfect those schemes or perfect what they wanted to do. Penn State would have been much better off under Franklin running a more, run-heavy, power-based offense, similar to what Jim Harbaugh at Michigan did, or even mimicking what Wisconsin did for all those years. But since you have better talent and can recruit better, you could actually have a competent passing game and a more reliable, consistent, big-time rushing attack paired with it. And it felt like Franklin, as an offensive guy, always had his hands too much in the offense, was too insecure about it. So even though the talent isn't the same, and I think overall actually has regressed even on offense, I do believe you're going to get better results just based on better cohesion. On defense, this defense will be better than last year's defense. It will help that you're not going to have a team and culture that is going to quit by the end of September, beginning of October. It will also help that they return several players who made key contributions at some point during the year. And they add in a lot of Iowa State players, good Iowa State players at defensive back, at linebacker, Marcus Neal Jr., Caleb Bacon. It helps that they have at least added depth to the defensive line. I don't love the starters or the upside of this defensive line, but when you have Keanu Williams, for example, up the middle, when you have some youth that was previously recruited by the Franklin regime, like Max Granville, Yvan Kimayo, when you have Armstrong Nadodim on the other defensive tackle position alongside of Williams, and then you have a lineup of redshirt senior, redshirt sophomore, redshirt senior, sophomore in your 2-deep, and you have some juniors even in your 3-deep, you have depth there. And I believe for year one under Matt Campbell, having depth on the defensive line is more important than, say, you have denied Dennis Sutton or you have an Abdul Carter, but if they go down, you're going to look way different, far, far different. That is something that was always a rightful criticism of the Franklin regime at Penn State. They were really never deep on the lines of scrimmage, and they were never really known to be big and strong there outside of a few players, such as Olu Fashanu, their tackle from 2023 that got drafted in the first round. Abdul Carter was electric as an edge, more of a pass rush guy, though, than like an all-around super versatile edge, although versatile in a variety of ways in pass defense. And he was elite that year. But this Penn State team will have a better emphasis, I believe, on the depth and physicality components that lacked under Franklin, and will also they'll be more confident in themselves. They'll believe in themselves more. So that helps. And I do like this staff, particularly Campbell, who I have as a top 15 head coach in America and is one of the best coaches in a loaded Big Ten and in a loaded Power 4. Taylor Mauser I liked as an OC hire, and I also love D'Anton Lynn. I think that some USC people give him too much flack. It didn't work out at USC for a variety of reasons, but I do think that he is a good defensive mind based on how quickly he fixed USC's defense in year one and what he did at UCLA. In sum, I do not think Penn State can win the Big Ten this year. I believe they can get to Indianapolis, and they have an easier, more likely path to get to Indy than a USC or Michigan, despite the fact that I believe those two teams are power rated much higher than Penn State, because Penn State has a much easier schedule than they do. They play both of them, and they get USC at home in cross-country travel. But if they get to Indianapolis, and if they do, they're going to be paired with one of Indiana, Oregon, or Ohio State. They don't have the continuity, the depth, the experience, they haven't implemented their developmental process far enough where I think in year one they can just come out and win the Big Ten. I do believe they can reach Indianapolis, though. Having the schedule they do helps, and when you have an easy schedule and you have some talent, and more importantly, you have an identity and a coaching staff to develop and nurture that talent, and the games are spaced out in a way that's very advantageous, they could win some close games. They could have 7 or 8 blowouts and maybe have one loss and an 11-1, 8-1 in Big Ten play, which I think is actually realistic. It's not likely, but I do think that's very realistic. They could find themselves in Indianapolis for sure. I think next year or following years, those would be the seasons to look at Penn State as a potential Big Ten champion. I do believe it will take a bit of time, though, unless Matt Campbell can imitate what Cignetti did, and it's so hard to imitate what was done at Indiana. It's so challenging to do that. So, yeah. Next up, talking about why Jeremiah Smith is the best player in college football. Jeremiah Smith is already a lock to be the number 1 prospect in the 2028 NFL Draft. That is why he's the best player in college football. And I could end this off by not saying anything else, but I think I want to talk about for a few minutes why he's the best player in college football. I've seen for the past few months some, I would call them fools at worst, casuals at best on social media talk about why he's overrated or he has a ton of things to improve on. And honestly, look, even the best players have things they can improve on. But Jeremiah Smith was Ohio State's best receiver with Carnell Tate, who was drafted as a top 5 pick last year, and with Emeka Egbuka, who was drafted in the first round the previous year. In a loaded wide receiver room, he was the best out of those. He was the nation's best receiver as a true freshman, having over 1,000 yards and being an integral part of that 12-team playoff run. That was a historic Ohio State team, a historic Buckeye roster. It is competing with Day's 2019 team as his best team ever, and yet there are instances in different parts of their games where if, say, Miami gets Jeremiah Smith instead of Ohio State, they may not win the national title that year, or they may have lost an additional game. The history of Ohio State and perhaps the Ryan Day era is changed, if not for him. And Ryan Day is one of the best coaches in college football. He has all of my respect, and the staff does too. At the same time, Jeremiah Smith has done so much for that team and so much for that program in only 2 years. He is going to leave setting records for them. And when you were able to post as a true freshman and sophomore back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons and have 2 seasons as, you know, the leader of the team in touchdown receptions, it's nuts. He has made several one-handed catches. He has beaten some of the best defensive backs in college football. And in Ohio State's lowest moments, he is still shined bright. Think about the game against Oregon, where he was terrorizing them, and he had the questionable offensive pass interference call, but he was tormenting Oregon that whole game. Think about the Michigan game that year. Very low, dark day for Ohio State. He accounted for their only touchdown of the game and was terrorizing Michigan when they chose to throw to him, when the Buckeyes did. Think of that entire playoff run where Tennessee, Oregon, Texas, Notre Dame, in 3 of those games, they went directly to him and he couldn't get stopped. Texas was able to limit him, but only because they were paying him extra attention, and that opened up the doors for Carnell Tate and Emeka Egbuka to have success. Jeremiah Smith is going to be one of the top Buckeyes all time in receptions in only 3 years, compared to Emeka Egbuka and KJ Hill, who had 4. In a single season, it's going to be hard to match because of the new clock rules and how Ohio State wants to play slow. As a true freshman, he placed 7th all-time for Ohio State in receptions in a single season with 76. And I look at receiving yards. Jeremiah Smith has 2,558 and is 8th within 2 seasons. He is going to finish, depending on how long Ohio State's season is, with 1,000 more yards than Michael Jenkins and Emeka Egbuka, despite playing a year less than Jenkins and 2 years less than Egbuka. That's wild. He's not even 100 yards off from Marvin Harrison Jr.'s receiving yard total, despite playing a year less. Ryan Day himself has said to former players in an interview, Cam Hayward is the player I was looking for there, when Marvin Harrison Jr. left, that we have someone better coming in, that being Jeremiah Smith. And entering his junior year, I know Hartline is gone, but Hartline already developed him, so any concerns about that, I think you got to flush it out the window. At 6'3", 230 pounds, with an insane catch radius, with intense physicality, great speed, a wonderful ability to beat double or even triple coverage and make something out of nothing. Now, with a veteran quarterback who's been in the system for 2 years, with an improved offensive line that will better protect the quarterback and allow him to do a better job of passing the football and getting the football out, particularly in bigger games, and a season where there's more spotlight games for Ohio State than possibly any season before, he's going to go off and he's going to have success. And that's a fact. It is a fact that he is the nation's best player because even in Ohio State's worst moments, he has either willed them to victory or gotten close to willing them to victory. And in Ohio State's best moments, he has practically been front and center as the biggest reason why they have dominated in their best moments. This is an offense that under Arthur Smith, if everything goes well, he will be targeted at a higher rate ever before, compared to his prior 2 seasons. He will have the nation's most accurate quarterback targeting him. And if the pass protection up front improves, well, it's gonna give him more time to get open, and you don't need much time for Jeremiah Smith to get open against even the nation's best defensive back group. I'm excited to see this offense. I do believe the offense overall will improve. We've talked about this in previous videos. I do think that Ohio State, specifically in the rushing offense and pass protection department, will improve. I don't know how much statistically, because the schedules are completely different from last year to this year. They're almost polar opposites in terms of regular season difficulty. But I do believe that on film, you will see improvement. I think that advanced analytics that adjust for scheduling will reflect that. And I imagine that Ohio State and Jeremiah Smith specifically will be out for a little bit of revenge this year. I know that's a cliche. I know that most programs can claim that. I know that the best programs in America, Georgia, Ohio State, Indiana, they will use even the slightest shred of doubt, or they will simply use a mission as a motivator to go out and win and perform at the highest level. And Ohio State does that every year under Ryan Day. This year, though, it is Jeremiah Smith's final season, and you are going to play in many big games. And Ohio State under Ryan Day, I happen to think, does a pretty damn good job in big games. So, look, he's the nation's best player. I believe that from a yards per game standpoint, a touchdowns standpoint, from a wow play standpoint, he's going to have his best year of his career. And that's because I think with a tougher schedule and the amount of elite quarterbacks and offenses Ohio State plays and the amount of elite defensive lines they'll play, I think that they will have to at times move away from the slow turtle game where they run the ball, it gets to 3rd and medium or 3rd and long, they pass, they convert, or they get a big play. This is a team that is going to have to operate better in the red zone. I think they're going to have to be a little bit more pass happy in some situations. And with Carnell Tate leaving, but Smith and Sayin and the running backs and offensive line returning, I think that means they're going to be targeting Jeremiah Smith more this season. I think he will deserve the Heisman Trophy at the end of the season. I thought that he deserved it last season, or at least deserved an appearance to go to New York. It's not his fault that the award is very QB-centric, but I don't want to hear any argument or any debate about whether or not he is the best player in college football. He is. There has been no instance of him getting destroyed or dominated in a game that doesn't have another explanation. Like when Texas under Pete Kwiatkowski was able to lock, quote unquote, lock him down twice. Large part of that was Texas's defense. Another part of that was in the 2024 game. Ohio State's O-line was put in a blender, so they couldn't do everything they wanted. And in the 2025 game, they were playing it very safe with Sayin. He didn't throw the football that much. So there weren't many opportunities to get Jeremiah Smith the ball. And then to give Texas some credit there, they did do their best to, make sure that Smith was always watched and always covered. But when, even in your worst moments, it's because your opponent is doing something special for you and maybe your own roster or staff isn't, for good or bad reasons, utilizing you to your maximum, I think that indicates your importance there. He's the best player in college football, and despite wide receiver not having the positional value of quarterback, I would say, honestly, he's probably the most valuable player in all of college football as well. I mean, to have Jeremiah Smith as your receiver, Kurt Cignetti has talked about this, how he believes that Jeremiah Smith is as good or better than Julio Jones, and Julio Jones on those Alabama teams was a game breaker. He was a game wrecker. Imagine the conversation this year if Indiana had Jeremiah Smith in their wide receiver core. Just imagine that. What if Oregon had him? What if Texas had him? What Texas has with Cam Coleman, if you gave them Jeremiah Smith and Cam Coleman, that would be as good of a wide receiver room as what Ohio State had in 2024. And that receiver room was so good that it could break even the best defenses wide open. That's why I think that he's the best player and why I think he's the most valuable. I mean, I think that a lot of programs would take a downgrade at quarterback in exchange for getting him in their wide receiver room, if not possibly like all, if not possibly all teams in college football. Not saying a huge downgrade, but some type of downgrade in exchange for being able to get their hands on him as a receiver, as a blocker. I know people will reference the whole Miami thing. That was a weird play. He was the only player in that game, in the Indiana game, on offense that really looked like that really was still able to dominate or be effective in those matchups against those elite defenses. Speaking of loaded teams and of talent, I want to pan over to Oregon's cornerback room because I think Oregon is loaded there. Oregon's defense is one of the most talented position groups in all of college football. They return 4 NFL defensive linemen, and they return several players in their secondary who have NFL talent. Many of them, Brandon Finney, for example, are too young to be drafted in the 2027 NFL draft. And today I want to discuss how loaded Oregon's corner room is. To take a look at Oregon's starting defensive backs, let's review their projected starting secondary. Ifeoma Badegwu will start at corner, along with Brandon Finney on the other side. At nickel, Carl Williams IV is the projected starter there. At free safety, we have Aaron Flowers. At strong safety, we have Coy Parrish. Williams and Parrish are 2 incoming transfers. Flowers was a redshirt freshman last year that Lanning lauded for taking a huge step in year 2. Brandon Finney was a freshman All-American and immediately one of the best corners in America as a true freshman. And Ifeoma Badegwu, not quite as good as Finney, but still serviceable, had some good moments, is ultra talented, and was only a redshirt freshman. Oregon last year had a true freshman and 2 redshirt freshmen starting. Thieneman, I believe, what was it? Yeah, 23, 24, 25. He technically had an additional year of eligibility. Jaden Kennedy was really their only old player in their secondary. They were a pretty young group last season. And now all of their corners, except for Theron Johnson, who just turned out to not be a very good fit or evaluation for what Oregon wanted to do, he's the only departure from that group, along with some other backups, such as Dakota Fields. Brandon Finney is, I would say, perhaps the most physical corner in college football. The way that he is involved in stopping the run, the attitude he has, the physicality, the measurables, the talent. Honestly, he reminds me, and I don't know if this is a good comp or not. I'm not an NFL guy. I'm not an NFL draft guy. I try to do some of that stuff because it's fun, and I do believe I know things. But just a disclaimer here in case this comparison isn't necessarily the best. I think Finney reminds me a lot of Igbinosun from Ohio State last year and prior years if he didn't have a ton of penalty issues. He reminds me of a ahead of the curve Igbinosun. And Igbinosun last year was one of the best corners in college football, very underrated, a very energetic, physical, talented NFL specimen type of cornerback. Finney had 3 interceptions, 2 forced fumbles, 7 pass breakups, and 42 total tackles, all as a true freshman. This season, he's poised for even a bigger year. There were moments last year, at times against Indiana, at times against USC, where he just straight up got beat, and there's no way around that. Charlie Becker made him and Zabian Brown look slow, and those are 2 of the best corners in the entire country. That just happens. Like, Becker is a freak of nature and really a really good wide receiver, an elite wide receiver, And Fernando Mendoza was the best quarterback in America last year, and by quite a bit at the end of the season. Just happens. Sometimes you get beat and you have to tip your cap. Brandon Finney had some issues with Mekhi Lemon and Jacoby Lane, and that game was highly penalized. There were a lot of penalties in that game, a lot of undisciplined behavior from both sides. So to a certain degree, I might chalk that up as whatever. And I do think there's a kind of a rivalry between those two teams, so that could explain some of it. But again, Finney is a true freshman at that point, and he's going up against some of the best receivers in the sport, against USC's Lane and Lemon and Indiana's Cooper, Surratt, and Becker. With another year of training, with another year of coaching, and I believe having a defensive play calling upgrade at coordinator, I would expect him to have tremendous success. Ife Obadegwu had 1 interception and 6 pass breakups last year, with 24 total tackles and a 67.7 PFF grade. Has the measurables, has the talent, was a redshirt freshman last year and played well. I'm expecting a breakout season from him. And when you look at how young Oregon's secondary was last year and how many of them are coming back with all those reps, all those experience, with assistant coaching continuity and the way that Lanning recruits and develops and his history on defense, I have to think this is a secondary that is contending for one of the best in America. And I know I am fully well aware that Notre Dame exists, that Ohio State exists, that Indiana exists, that a lot of these other great defensive backfields exist. But this is a loaded corner room, and we haven't discussed safety yet. That's a different video, in part because I do believe corner is much stronger than safety due to the presence of Finney and due to how much returning production and talent they have. Oregon is loaded at corner. Safety, I think they're a bit more inexperienced / a bit more unproven. But I believe they're going to pan out at safety too. For the topic of corner, Oregon's corners this year have the physicality, the measurables, and the talent to where if they continue on their developmental track record that we've seen so far, not many receivers, except for Jeremiah Smith, because he's him, are going to be able to beat these corners straight up. And Oregon will be able to do this year what many thought they would do at the end of last year, when a lot of hyper-intelligent people, professional bettors, analysts thought that Oregon would beat them or Oregon would play them competitively, and Oregon's defense would be a huge reason why, and the improvements that they made throughout the season. It panned out at the time. Indiana had the better starting roster. They had a coaching staff edge, clearly. And look, if you play that game 10 times, the regular season matchup, the postseason matchup would probably tell you, due to, in part, IU's outside edge on top of all the other edges they had, they probably do win like a good 7 or 8 out of 10 times, maybe even more than that. I don't think they win 10 out of 10 times, though, as they would have against, say, in Alabama. And keep in mind how young Oregon was. A lot was made about age last year, and age does help, but it matters so much less in terms of meta than depth, than defensive line play, than quarterback play, than being able to field a multiple rushing offense, whether due to your offensive line or your running back room or the downfield blocking of your receivers or a combination of the few. It can hurt you, and it did hurt Oregon a bit last year, but now they're going to be almost across the board a year older, and I have faith in this Oregon coaching staff, and I think you all should too. Naeem Offord is an example of this, I believe. Recruited to Ohio State. We've seen how Ohio State has performed at defensive back over the past few seasons. They've done a pretty good job. Naeem Offord was committed to them for a minute. He flipped over to Oregon last second. Him and Devin Sanchez, who were supposed to be a part of that same Ohio State recruiting class, both played a lot as a true freshman. I'm expecting Sanchez to have a pretty big breakout year this season with Ohio State. And with how Oregon has performed at corner and how they've made some pretty big improvements in how they've recruited. I would feel guilty if I didn't expect Offord to have at least a similar type of breakout season to his 5-star counterpart, who was also from south of the Mason-Dixon line, did play in different leagues of high school football. I think Texas's league of high school football is better than Alabama's, but still 5-star talents were slated to be a part of the same DB room. I think that as the third man in this group, he's going to see plenty of playing time. He'll get involved. That will help with depth. That will help the team maintain its standard of defensive excellence if injuries occur. And I'm excited to see him. With Aaron Scott Jr., Aaron Scott was slated to be a next up guy in that Ohio State corner room. I can tell you from recruiting, from the fact that he did play some last year, like they did play him, he wouldn't have been better than Devin Sanchez, but he would have probably been competing for a nickel spot or competing for the third corner position, would have gotten much more playing time. He is better than Calhoun and Dominic Kelly, who they brought in from the portal at corner. He is, in my opinion. Oregon, I think, got someone who isn't necessarily a great player from what we know of yet, but is talented, did play on a good defense, has received good coaching for all the years that he's been at Ohio State, and has been, I think, developed handsomely by the Buckeyes. And that is going to also, as I mentioned with Offord, add some depth and allow them, if there are injuries or concerns of injuries, or if they need to use different formations where, say, they need a third corner on the field, they can put one out there and not have him be a weak link. I love what I see out of this Oregon secondary and really the Oregon defense overall. The strength of this defense is defensive line and its corner. Safety and linebacker, there are some questions. I do believe that they will be just fine there. The question with Oregon is not talent. This is the best defensive roster that I have seen this season. It is a defensive roster at the defensive line and corner position that I think could rival the defensive lines that we saw in the 2021, 2022 Georgia seasons. It is a corner room that can rival some of the best, I would say, Iowa or Michigan corner rooms from the early 2020s, where Cooper DeJean, Will Johnson, Mikey Sainristil, it's an uber talented defense. The question is coaching. The question is play calling, and I believe a little bit about other positions that we haven't talked about. But what this corner room can do, if it continues to improve, and there's no reason to believe that it wouldn't, if it plays at the level that I believe it will, which is a corner room that is going to compete for the best in the nation, the only receiver rooms then that I think could get this Oregon team are of the following. Ohio State, because they have Jeremiah Smith. Texas, because they have Cam Coleman. Oregon, I really trust in terms of depth, so maybe their own receiver room in practice could get them a bit. And if Marsh and Becker pan at Indiana, you could also be looking at them. You take out Oregon's own, and you're really looking at only a handful of teams whose receivers could even touch these corners. And safety, I believe, will be good enough too, where combine that with the corner room, it's going to be very hard to pass on this Oregon team. It's going to be really, really hard. If linebacker isn't great, the way to beat them might be running for 4 yards in a cloud of dust and hoping that you slow down Oregon's offense enough to beat them in a close, low-scoring wrestling match. But that's going to be hard to do too, knowing what Oregon has offensively. So this corner room is loaded. It's a huge part of the reason why I have Oregon winning it all for now, and why even if I do flip my pick on that at some point, I have them preseason power rated number 1, and I don't think that I will move off of that. They have the best roster in the country, and their cornerback room is a huge part of that. When you have Brandon Finney and Ifeoma Badegwu in your starting lineup, and then you have Naeem Offord and Aaron Scott as your backups, I mean, those are two players that would be starting at a lot of Power 4 schools at corner, or at least one of them would be. You have depth, you have talent, you have the proven production as well to succeed in defending almost any passing offense that you encounter as one of the nation's best passing defenses. So that's incredible. And look, possibly one of the best position groups in all of college football. I would pay attention to Oregon's corner room. Other corner rooms, as I already mentioned, look, I know that Notre Dame, Ohio State, Texas, I think Texas is pretty loaded at corner. Georgia, Indiana. I think I already mentioned Notre Dame. There are so many schools with good corner rooms. I mean, we're going to be talking about one in Miami here. I happen to think that Miami's corners are pretty good, and with all of them coming back, I think that they'll probably have some breakout seasons. But we're not talking about Miami's corner room. What we're instead talking about here is the biggest threats to Miami in the ACC. Miami is the overwhelming favorite to win the ACC. I believe they are minus 140 in FanDuel odds to win the conference. That's pretty insane. That is, FanDuel and other sports books have Miami as either a sharper bet or a similar bet in terms of minus odds. It means they have Miami is the overwhelming favorite to win the ACC. And I do agree with that, despite some of my predictions for Miami that are more on the negative side than most. So today I wanted to discuss the biggest threats to Miami in the ACC, because like Texas Tech in the Big 12, or like Notre Dame in terms of odds to reach the playoffs, those three teams are just so overwhelmingly favored to basically reach the postseason that I think it's entertaining to talk about who could challenge them, if anyone has a chance to challenge them. Let me know if you believe Miami will win its first ACC title ever, or if you think that streak will be delayed. SMU is the perfect place to start out with for me. Why is that? Well, let's just put it this way. SMU is top 25 in returning production. They, in preseason S&P Plus, are top 30. FPI has not dropped yet, sadly, and that is a fantastic crime by ESPN, but I imagine SMU will be close to the top 25 there as they return a good chunk, and they were top 30 in FPI last year. They return a quarterback in Kevin Jennings that I don't think a lot of people understand how good he is and how much of a veteran he is. This will be his third season starting in the ACC. And they are one of the few ACC teams that I believe has a Big Ten SEC feel in terms of lines of scrimmage play and in terms of coaching. Miami has those things. Miami has one of the better staffs in college football. They have one of the better rosters in the sport, one of the better developmental programs. So if anyone is going to be challenging them in the ACC, wouldn't it be logical to assume that one of those teams is going to be, say, I don't know, one of the few other ACC teams who can do those things? Maybe not at the same level. They don't recruit at the same level. But why couldn't it be SMU's year this season with how much they return, with their coach in Rhett Lashley? And I think an offensive line in Joshua Bates, Addison Nichols, Andrew Chamblee, PJ Williams, and Drummond Odoms, who are competing for being one of the best offensive lines in college football. And a defense that has done enough in the portal, that's done enough in terms of returning production, where their defensive front is going to be pretty stout and intimidating. They don't play Miami in the regular season, so in order to be a threat to Miami, Miami either has to play themselves out of the ACC title game and SMU gets in and then wins, or SMU has to beat them head-to-head in Charlotte. Louisville, this is another team, and I put this team in a similar category to SMU, where Braum had success in the Big Ten, albeit the Big Ten West, but he brought Purdue to the Big Ten championship game in 2022. He did a wonderful job developing offensive pieces there, having underrated running backs, having some underrated players on defense, like Karl Loftus. And he has that this season. They have an underrated collection of running backs in Keon Brown and Isaac Brown. Clev Lubin right now I have as college defensive end number 1. I don't think that means he'll be drafted a defensive end 1 in the NFL, but he has the most proven production out of any ACC defensive end, out of any, I would say even like Notre Dame defensive end. I love to put Notre Dame in the ACC because they're an affiliate, and that way they get talked about. Lubin last year had 8.5 sacks and 3 fumbles, and he got some of them against EKU and JMU, Virginia, Clemson, Kentucky, Toledo, where his 2 forced fumbles came from. I'm aware they didn't exactly have sacks in some of the bigger games, but he did a great job getting pressure throughout the season. And you combine him with players like TJ Capers and Stanquan Clark at linebacker, Antonio Watts and Cohen Entringer at safety, and Louisville has some good defensive players. They have a quarterback in Lincoln Keenholz who has legs, and you combine that with those running backs and some of the receivers that Louisville has with Jeff's, ability to be an offensive savant. And I like what Louisville has. I mean, Lubin, to circle back to him, I was looking this up while talking, he had 64 total pressures, 5 against Miami, including a hit on the quarterback. And Miami had the best offensive line last year, and by quite a bit, I believe, the best pass blocking O-line, the best O-line in terms of preventing tackles for loss. He comes back to Louisville, and they have enough on defense and enough on offense to where they can absolutely win the ACC this year. Georgia Tech does not have the same returning production as SMU. It's even lower than Louisville, and they didn't exactly do a ton in the portal. There's one player who can change that, though. Justice Haynes. Justice Haynes was a Heisman contender before getting injured with Michigan, and you pair him with Malachi Hosley, with Josh Petty, with Ethan McKinney, with Georgia Tech's offensive line. You pair that offense with a defense that cannot get worse than it was last season in Brent Key's coaching, and you're looking at a Georgia Tech team that yet again can be a sleeper in the preseason and contend for 8, 9, or 10 wins, and depending on who those wins come against and how the ACC sorts itself, you could be looking at Georgia Tech in the ACC title game. I love Brent Key as a coach. I respect Rhett Lashley. I respect Jeff Brom. Respect, obviously, Mario Cristobal. Brent Key is a underrated name and one of the better coaches in the ACC with one of the better staffs. I'm curious to see how they replace the coordinators, how they replace Haynes King, what Justice Haynes does at Georgia Tech. There's a good chance that Louisville and Georgia Tech have the top 2 running back rooms in college football. For Virginia Tech, they're a threat to Miami. They actually play Miami. Miami does not play Georgia Tech, Louisville, or SMU, but they do play Virginia Tech. And James Franklin is not exactly a big game winner, but while I am a Penn State truther, I guess you could say, in the sense that I believe James Franklin deserved to get fired from Penn State and that Penn State deserved better, I do wonder how much of Franklin's blunders and how much of that collapse was due to the Big Ten having some loaded coaches. So Cignetti, Franklin never played Cignetti, but Cignetti put a ton of pressure on Penn State for sure. For sure. They put a ton of pressure on everyone with what they did in 2024, and how they kicked off 2025. I think it started to put pressure on all the top programs too, even before they were viewed as a national title contender. After they blew out Illinois, for example, you look at Ryan Day, who he played several times. You look at Jim Harbaugh, who he played several times. You look at Dan Lanning, same thing. Those are some loaded coaches, and many of them will go in the Hall of Fame. Some of them will be viewed as the best football coaches, or if you want to get more narrow, college football coaches of all time. And with Mario Cristobal, I think that he'll be in the Hall of Fame. I think he's a great coach. We haven't seen him for more than a year play or coach at the level that Harbaugh did for 3 or 4 years at Michigan, the 3 years where he won the Big Ten, and the 2016 team was pretty damn good. We haven't seen him do what Ryan Day has done for multiple years in a row. Even what Cignetti did for 2 years in a row. Cignetti's made the playoff in back-to-back seasons. We can't say the same for Cristobal yet. It's the same with Dan Lanning. I think that Cristobal's a really good coach, but Virginia Tech and James Franklin no longer have the same coaching disadvantage they did in the Big Ten. Franklin is a much better coach in the ACC in terms of placement than he is in the Big Ten in terms of placement, and it's not even close, really. You combine that with them bringing in Ethan Grunkemeyer, with them returning Marcellus Hawkins, with a cornerback room of Jaquez White, Cam Chadwick Jr., Kenny Wosley Jr., and Isaiah Brown Murray, along with Tyson Flowers at safety, and a group at wide receiver in Quayshawn Brown and Aiden Green, with Ethan Grunkemeyer at quarterback. And this Virginia Tech team, to me, is a lot like a Walmart Penn State team. They have some questions in the lines of scrimmage, but that defensive backfield and that running back room, the QB room, the tight end room with Luke Reynolds, who I have as a first team, all Big Ten, all SEC tight end, and those receivers. I know Penn State hasn't recently had receiver success, but check out the Franklin teams in the 2010s. They had a lot of receiver success. This reminds me of an older James Franklin team, like a throwback Franklin team, where in the 2020s they got better on the defensive front and even on the offensive line, and seemingly traded that for having worse receiver and QB play. In the 2010s, they were worse in the lines of scrimmage than a lot of the Big Ten. They made up for it with being amazing at linebacker, amazing at DB, good enough on the D line, and having some freaks at tight end, running back, receiver, and good enough QB play. And this Virginia Tech team reminds me of those throwback Franklin teams, say 2016, 2017, 2018, in a very Walmart way. Obviously, they don't have Saquon Barkley, a Miles Sanders, but Grunkemeyer, with how he played at Penn State last year, could be a good quarterback. And with the players they have, that could be enough to have some success in the ACC and potentially win the league in year one. Virginia, this is another threat. Virginia returns enough on defense in the offensive line, and they lost enough close games paired with enough of their close wins where I think they could win 10 games again. And Bo Pribula is a superior quarterback when healthy to Chandler Morris. He has more athleticism, his arm is good enough, and with what they return in the offensive line, what they have with Peyton Lewis at running back, I believe Virginia will have a superior rushing offense this year than they had last season. Virginia was a very interesting team last year. They only ran for 4.6 yards per carry. Their average team passer rating was a 129.2. Defensively, they had 31 sacks, which is good, but given the schedule they had, maybe not ideal. Really, I think the difference with Virginia is they made 80% of their kicks, and they attempted 30 of them. And they had Trell Harris, Jamal Edgerine, Cam Ross. They had some good receivers, and they won close games, also lost some close games, and I think they had good coaching with Tony Elliott and company. So pay attention to Virginia here. Last but not least, we'll spend a few minutes on this one because I think it's a bit special, is Clemson. How do I put this? Clemson is a program that I think is dying. I'm pretty confident in the fact that they are dying. And when I look at them, I do not believe that this season they will be the same caliber of threat as a SMU, Louisville, Virginia Tech, even Virginia or Georgia Tech. They will be power rated higher than some of those teams, but due to my view on Clemson's staff and what they have at quarterback, I think some of their talent will yet again be mismanaged in a way that at these other schools, they won't mismanage their talent. I, at the same time, want to acknowledge that they could rebound and could be a threat. In preseason S&P Plus, they're 23rd. They're 59th in returning production, which is low, but given how returning production is at an all-time low, it's not as low as, say, 59th would have been a few years ago. And in the portal, they did okay. This is their best portal class in quite some time, and they have Bryant Wesco, TJ Moore at receiver. I actually think they have the second best, or possibly they could have the best receiver duo in the ACC. Tony is the best receiver, but I think both TJ Moore and Bryant Wesco are significantly better than Cooper Barcade. Barcade just had a better offensive game plan and a superior, more consistent quarterback. They also had to throw the ball much more because Duke's defense was even worse than Clemson's, and they were playing in a lot of close contests. So having possibly the best receiver duo, there is a world with what they have at edge that they could have the best or one of the best edge groups in the ACC along with Miami and Louisville. That's something to pay attention to. And Ashton Hampton is someone who they internally are very high on, and from an NFL angle, I'm very high on him simply due to measurables and his talent. So there is a world where, hey, if Tom Allen has a defense that better fits what he wants to do, and the Chad Morris hire pans out, and Vizina develops and the receivers are healthier, and the mentality of the team is better, because much like Penn State, I think part of Clemson's problem last year is after they lost their first big game, the team just kind of fell into a spiral as they didn't expect themselves to lose. They got caught with their pants down. If some of those things pan out in a way that Clemson wants, they could rebound, and their championship window from a national angle is over for now. The ACC is weak enough, though, and they get Miami at home to where they could win the ACC this year. Those are the teams that have the best chance of denying Miami from winning their first ACC title. Ultimately, I agree that Miami should be the favorite. I have Miami power rated ahead of the second best ACC team by quite a bit. I don't think Miami will win the ACC this year due to mostly the yearly Cristobal, the annual Cristobal loss to some random team on the road. And with how weak the conference is and how weak the schedules of SMU and Louisville in conference are, I think that will be enough to keep Miami out of the title game entirely. Doesn't mean they won't make the playoff. They did last year despite not reaching the ACC championship game. But I think that Miami, they could go 12-0, but between the Notre Dame game on the road, which isn't a conference game, and more importantly, if you're a Miami fan, I don't hate you. I'd kind of love it if Miami went to the playoff again and had success, because your fan base is very engaging. That gets me views. That gets me money. So it's good. And having an ACC program that can be a title contender every year would be fantastic. It'd bring more balance to the sport. Look at every season with him at Miami, even last year, and him at Oregon. There's always a game that he should not drop with hindsight, and he drops it. It's a trend. I'm following a trend here, and that's why I'm actually picking SMU, who's been to the ACC title game before under Rhett Lashlee in his first year. I am picking them to reach the ACC championship game and win the ACC. As for Texas Tech, who are the biggest threats to Texas Tech in the Big 12? These teams have the strongest chance of denying Texas Tech and Brennan Sorsby a Big 12 championship, and likely in doing so, they could deny Texas Tech a college football playoff appearance. There's been a lot of news about this whole Brennan Sorsby eligibility situation, and one reply from a great friend of the channel, Buffton Prime TCal, to people talking about this was, okay, I don't necessarily know if Sorsby should be playing or not, but one way that you could prevent Texas Tech from being rewarded by fighting for Sorsby's eligibility is by beating them on the field. So who are these teams that could beat Texas Tech on the field, or who could have a chance to do so? Because much like Miami in the ACC, I think that Texas Tech has the best team in the Big 12. I have them power rated by I can actually look it up right now. I mention this all the time, then I don't look it up. It's not the most transparent thing in the world. I understand that I don't always have the time to go over that stuff, but I do right now. I have them favored by 9.5 points over BYU on a neutral field, and that's the second best Big 12 team. So they're clearly number one in the conference that they reside in. They were, though, last year, and they still lost to Arizona State. I think this year, their roster is still far and away the best in the Big 12. I have Texas Tech with the number one. This is even factoring in the resources they have. Due to last year's performance, I think that they have the number one DC in the Big 12 and the number one general manager in the Big 12 and the number one scouting department in the Big 12. It's them or BYU in a lot of those categories. And maybe ASU or Utah, depending on how those things pan out. Just need to see a bit more of them. Anyway, enough of my rambling, enough of my jab. Let's get to the biggest threats to Texas Tech here. We're just talking about BYU. I think BYU is the biggest threat. As I mentioned, BYU is my second highest power-rated team in the Big 12, and they're actually that by quite a big margin when I consider how close BYU and pretty much all the teams that we're going to be discussing are to each other. They're pretty much all within, I would say, a touchdown of each other. And if you factor in matchups or you factor in that they don't have many differences in terms of blue chip talent, you could make an argument that they're all pretty much within a field goal of each other. BYU is top 20 in returning production. They are old. They're experienced. They did lose Jay Hill to Michigan, their defensive coordinator, but outside of him, they pretty much have perfect staff continuity. They project right now to be my number one or at worst number two offensive line in the Big 12. And the defensive line, if Justin Kirkland can stay healthy with Keanu Tenuvasa returning and some of what they have at edge and Isaiah Glasker, Kedu Lave at linebacker, they could also have one of the best defensive fronts, not just offensive fronts in the conference. If you are going to beat Texas Tech, you have to block them, whether defensively or offensively. You have to do these things. Also bringing in Walker Lyons at tight end and Roger Seliapaga II should be helpful too. Those were USC and Oregon tight ends respectively. So BYU will now have a level of talent, measurables, and strength at the tight end position that I don't quite know if they had in prior seasons. Bear Bachmeier is also entering year 2. LJ Martin was a 1,000-yard rusher, and he comes back. And you have Kalani Sitake as their head coach, and there is a strong case to be made. If he wins 11 or 12 games again this year, the case will be unanimous. He'll be a top 10 coach in the sport. BYU has money. They have the potential to start fielding near BCR caliber teams, and even if they can do that, maybe even down the road be a dark horse national title contender. I don't think they'll ever win it all. I just have to see it to believe it with the current landscape of things, but there's a world with some of the money and booster backing they have from businesses, from segments of the Mormon church, to where that's possible. They care very deeply about their football program there, and I think their history would show that. They're not that team this year, though. But what gives them hope for maybe at least reaching the playoffs, on top of obviously hosting Notre Dame this season, their lines of scrimmage play and defensive back play and QB play is good enough to where on any given Saturday they could absolutely beat Texas Tech. I mean, they're competing with Texas Tech for having the best safeties, the best corners, the best offensive line, the best tight ends. They're competing for many schools in the Big 12 for having one of the better quarterback or running back groups. I think this is clearly the second best team in the conference. Utah is another threat here. Not as good as BYU, but I have some faith that Scaly, with the staff that he's assembled and with Devin Dampier returning and much of their defensive backfield returning, can produce at a high level and get back to winning 10 games again. Keep in mind this year's schedule is also easier for Utah. They don't play Texas Tech, and they get BYU at home. So they have an easier road to go to the Big 12 title game. Utah with Jonathan Hall and Trey Reynolds has one of the better linebacker groups in the Big 12. Not quite as good as Texas Tech, but I would say second there, competing with BYU. They have Lance Holtzclaw at edge, who their staff is very high on. They have enough at running back, and I would say enough at O-line with Dampier to still field a pretty damn good offense this season. And at the end of the day, I do trust that program. Scally is a first-year head coach. They have a lot of new pieces roster and staff-wise, but that was a top 15 team last year. Some even thought they were top 10, and I think there might be an argument for that. I think they're a top 25 team, maybe top 20. That's all Arizona State was last year when healthy, and they were able to pull off an upset against Texas Tech. So I would classify them as a threat. Oklahoma State. This team's a threat. They host Texas Tech in the regular season, so they're the first team we've talked about that plays Texas Tech in the regular season. They have a pretty tough schedule, but what they have that these other teams, except for maybe Utah with Dampier, do not, is fantastic QB play. And Mestemaker is certainly a better NFL QB than Dampier is. College QB, I don't quite know, because Dampier gives an element with his legs and his durability as a runner that can cause defenses that he plays to snowball and break under pressure and really get things going. Mestemaker, though, has that with his arms, with his hands, with his brain, his ability to precisely pick apart defenses. He never started in high school, and now he is going to be one of the best quarterbacks in college football this year. He had top 25 QBR despite playing at North Texas, and it's very hard to have a high-end QBR when playing a weak schedule. He led the nation in passing yards. He was tied for second in passing touchdowns, I think only behind Mendoza there. And much of his supporting cast is transferring with him to Oklahoma State, where guess what? They'll be a year older, they'll be stronger, more cohesion. They're joined by some talented transfers from the Power 4 ranks, so this will be an older, deeper North Texas in a league in the Big 12 that isn't that much tougher than the American, to where you'd expect Oklahoma State to have a really tough first year. If they can get things clicking, Oklahoma State can beat Texas Tech, whether in the regular season, whether in a rematch in the Big 12 title game, or maybe Oklahoma State, in beating them, somehow keeps Texas Tech out of the Big 12 title. I think Oklahoma State, with Eric Morris as their head coach, and Mestemaker at quarterback, and Wyatt Young at receiver, Caleb Hawkins at running back, and some of the pieces they have even on defense and the offensive line, you have to classify them as a threat here. Stillwater is a passionate place with passionate fans. It's a tough place to play when they're good. Oklahoma State should be good this year, and Texas Tech has enough questions at the quarterback position with this pushback about Sorsby, and it's not a known whether or not he's going to play. I think that's still a little bit up in the air. This isn't over yet. So I'm curious to see Oklahoma State this year. They're very underrated. We don't do betting on this show because I have questions about a lot of its ethics, but people that I trust who do bet professionally, they like Oklahoma State. They like them a lot. They love the value on them. So if that's your thing, you can feel free to check that out. Houston is a threat because Willie Fritz is a damn good head coach, because Willie Fritz is a veteran roster, and Willie Fritz used the portal at a very impressive level. They might have the best receiver in the Big 12 in Amari Thomas. They could have one of the better quarterbacks in the Big 12 in Connor Weigman. Offensively, they might be a bit one-dimensional, but I think the offensive line, quarterback, and receiver room is good enough where it'll be the best offense that Houston's had so far under Willie Fritz. Defensively, they're competing with Tech for having the best edge group in the Big 12. Ashton Porter, Brandon Mack II, and Latravian McCutcheon, that is a fantastic group of defensive ends. And Khalil Lafo is one of the best defensive tackles in the nation in the Big 12 as well. You also got to consider Jaden Yates and Sione Fotu at linebacker, Jordan Allen at safety, Will James at corner, along with Jalen Mayo at that position, and Kentrell Webb going back to safety. Right now, when I look at defenses, I see Texas Tech at 1, then I see Houston or BYU at 2. And I think Utah can be in that conversation for sure, along with maybe Arizona State as well. That's what I see. And Willie Fritz, we've seen it before at Tulane. We've seen it at Houston. We've seen them, beat Lincoln Riley. We've seen them compete with Ole Miss under Lane Kiffin when they had that home and home with them when Tulane played them. I like what I'm seeing here out of what Houston's building under Fritz in the long run and what they could be this season. They won a ridiculous amount of close games, though, just for context. But they catch Texas Tech early enough in the year where, say, Sorsby doesn't play. And Houston does travel to Lubbock. But Houston has a good enough roster and good enough players to maybe pull off a close win there. Kansas State is another team that is a threat. With Colin Klein commanding that group of players, Kansas State is one of the more talented rosters, I believe, from a recruiting angle in the Big 12. They've recruited pretty well given their location under Kleiman. Kansas State is passionate about football after Bill Schnieder built them back up. And then you had Chris Kleiman win a Big 12 title there. Colin Klein was one of the best, if not maybe the best quarterback under Bill Schnieder, who Bill Schnieder is one of the best coaches all time in college football. To rebuild Kansas State from where they were and to be competing for national champions, where they lost to Texas A&M one year in overtime for the Big 12 title game, and if they win that game, they play for a natty. Yeah, one of the best coaches of all time, Bill Schnieder. And Colin Klein being an offensive genius who convinced people that Marcel Reed was a good quarterback when he's not, who helped Mike Elko figure out offense at Texas A&M. And really, Texas A&M's offense, I think, was the best side of the football last year, in large part because of his coaching and because of how he knew how to utilize those players. I think that with Joe Jackson and Rodney Fields at running back, Avery Johnson at QB, who I view a lot like Marcel Reed, like very talented, very inconsistent though, John Pastor and enough on the offensive line, Josh Manning, Jerron Tibbs, Isaiah Williams at receiver, Garrett Oakley at tight end. You combine that with Wendell Gregory on defense and Caleb Patterson at corner and enough on defense to where if everything goes right, Kansas State can get back to winning 10 games, or maybe they could even win 11 games. Or who's to say they couldn't be that second best team in the Big 12? Because we know that Texas Tech's the most talented, at least right now. They're spending close to, if not more than double, the second highest spender. But I like what Kansas State has here, and I would be the least bit surprised if they end up winning the Big 12 this year, or at least competing for a Big 12 championship. Finally is the Big 12 champions from 2 years ago, the Arizona State Sun Devils. They're probably your second best spender in the Big 12. It's them or BYU. They have a massive alumni base. They have a involved head coach, a young head coach. They have a collection of good players, and they have an underrated staff. The problem is they've kind of been a feeder program the past few years for bigger programs. Think about, Sam Leavitt going to LSU when Arizona State really helped him and developed him. Think about, I don't know too many more of their transfers that went outgoing, if I'm being honest. I know that they brought in Amarion Miller from Colorado, but Sam Leavitt leaving and then their low amount of returning production and Dillingham constantly talking about how they need more NIL, they need more engagement. It was rumored that Michigan was pursuing him. It feels like they are kind of in danger of being a bit of a program that can cycle up some years, but bigger and better schools are going to try to poach their best players, their most impactful players. And I don't like that, and I think it's very sad. Raleek Brown is an example of that too, going to Texas. So They're probably the lowest on this list due to the low returning production, but I have Dillingham as probably the second or third best coach on this list. I have the Big 12's best head coach as Satake right now. These six plus McGuire would be your top seven for sure. And I think there is a good debate about how you could order them. I would probably put Dillingham at two, just given how impressive that 2024 campaign was and how ASU was a dump when he took them over. So they do have that coaching edge. I happen to think Cutter Boley in that system could be great. And Miller's one of the best wide receivers in the Big 12. They also return CJ Fight. Amarian Winston transfers in from Baylor. They return Lyric Rawls, and they have some players like Ashton Stamps and Adrian Wilson at secondary who I like. They also bring in Reed Harris from Boston College, who's one of the few bright spots of Boston College's team all season long, last season. So those are the biggest threats to Texas Tech in the Big 12. Even if Sorsby doesn't play, I'm probably more confident in Tech to win the Big 12 than Miami to win the ACC, just by a little bit. And that's mostly because the ACC does have more talent in terms of measurables, in terms of BCR. I do think the Big 12's the stronger league. So in terms of power ratings, I would be told that there's probably an equivalent chance of both of them to win their leagues. And I think that the coaching in the Big 12 is a little bit better. But the ACC has enough inherent talent, and Miami is losing enough. They have less returning production than Texas Tech does, and I wonder how that would look without Sorsby. But with Sorsby, it's dramatically less than what Texas Tech does have. Where I would still favor Texas Tech to win the Big 12. As of right now, I have them winning the Big 12. We can check in on that later, though, when I redo these predictions in July. Don't know why I did that. We are almost done, though. We're, I think, an hour 30. No, hour 20. We're an hour 20 through the stream. We only have like 4 topics left. It shouldn't be that long. I am going to take a very brief water break, and then we will be back. So I will see you guys in like probably 5 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for the patience. We'll now be discussing why USC's defensive line will decide the season. The Trojan defensive line is the most important position for the 2026 football team. Why is that? Well, we know with Maava returning that quarterback is set, and we will see an improvement or more of the same that we got out of Jade Maava last season, which was fourth in QBR, a great quarterback at home, a above average good field general on the road. There are areas for improvement, but we know that he's going to be great, and he's not going to be why USC could have an unsuccessful season or not a reason why they can't break through. I trust Dennis Simmons enough at wide receiver, as with Hartline at USF as their head coach, he could be the best receiver coach in the nation now. He's produced Deuce Robinson, Mekhi Lemon, Jacoby Lane, helped Jordan Addison out a little bit, and he also did great things at Oklahoma. So receiver is set. The offensive line is returning plenty of its production, and it was good enough last season to have a functional run game and pass defense. And tight end with Mark Bowman and running back with all who's returning in King, Miller, and Wademan Jordan, USC could have two 1,000-yard rushers there. The D-line, in my opinion, will decide the season and is the most important position because despite all the talent on it last year, it was a unit that did not impact the big games in a way that USC needed it to. It was nowhere to be found against Notre Dame. It was nowhere to be found against Oregon. Part of me only thinks it was to be found against Michigan because when Justice Haynes went down, it rattled Michigan a bit, and it was a horrid matchup for Michigan schematically. And it wasn't too much to be found against Illinois. Illinois did not have a great offensive line or a great rushing attack or a fantastic offense, and they were able to put USC even up front at times on skates. A huge part of the reason why they were able to kick the game-winning field goal is they were able to run the ball a little bit on their 2-minute drill to get down and get into field goal range. This unit, which their projected starters right now are Braylon Shelby, Alex Van Sumeren, Jade Abasiri, and Cameron Crawford. You will have Jakeem Stewart, you will have Zariah Fisher, you will have others in this mix. You will have some younger players that we will talk about as well who are in the mix. This is just currently, per our lads, the projected starting lineup. Current. Subject to change. They all are talented. Van Sumeren was a 4-star out of high school. Abasiri, Crawford, and Shelby were too. And Shelby and Crawford in particular are pretty big for their positions, like 6'5", 265. They have great length. That is your ideal size for a defensive end. It is. And a big enough defensive end where you're not really an edge or outside linebacker type player who is more of a pass rusher. They have the capability to be complete defensive ends who can shut down the run, who can function as pass rushers. Much like JTT and Jack Sawyer at Ohio State, much like some of the Michigan defensive ends we've seen before, much like the defensive ends that Oregon has this year, some past Georgia ones. They have the measurables, they have the potential. The question is, will they put it together? They had 10 combined sacks last year and 51 combined pressures. Those numbers have got to go up. They got to have PFF grades above the lower to mid 60s. And the defensive tackle position, I think they have to do the same thing. They have to translate the talent to production. Keyshawn Silver was a player they were high on and got him out of the portal. He was not very good. Abasiri was, but they needed depth, so they brought in Van Sumeren from Michigan State, who's been an all-right player, but he needs to take that step forward too. I don't pick linebacker because linebacker's positional value isn't the same as defensive line. It's similar with secondary, but close enough to where if the secondary had more talent than the D-line, I'd say the secondary might be the more important position. But I don't agree with that. I strongly think that USC's defensive line is really the only part of this defense outside of maybe corner that as currently constructed has upper echelon Big Ten talent level. And therefore they need it to play at that level, not just have the potential to play at that level. Because that's how you're going to stop the run. That's how you're going to affect quarterbacks. And you play Dante Moore, Julian Sayin, Josh Hoover, Colton Joseph, Rocco Becht, Nico Iamaleava with a better staff, and DeMond Williams. Should have mentioned DeMond Williams earlier. You play a lot of good quarterbacks this year and a lot of great offensive lines, great rushing attacks. Jakeem Stewart had a good year as a true freshman last year, but with 1.5 sacks, 8 pressures, 18 total tackles, and a 66.6 PFF grade, they need him to take a huge step forward and go from just a budding true freshman to a great sophomore player. I'm very high on him. I think that he's going to start at some point this year and move into that official starting lineup and not just be a rotational player, as it is projected right now. From Louisiana, I think he reclassified. Like, he's a bit young for his class, but he's phenomenal. He is a elite. He has the potential. Want to classify that, the potential to be an elite player. I think you're going to see flashes of that this year, and he'll be certainly a good player, if not maybe a great player. Outside of the starters and him that I've talked about, you have Zariah Fisher, who's a vet from Penn State, had 30 pressures last year, but only 2 sacks. And there's this other player who I find to be intriguing, Jamion Winfield, that USC has mentioned and they've talked about. He was a 5-star per 24/7 Sports last season, and per Rivals, he was a top 40 player from the state of Texas. I love Texas high school football, and he kind of flew under the radar for me. But then I heard people mention him in comments. I heard people mention him on, USC boards, and at 6'3", 325 pounds, from the state of Texas, offered by Alabama, by Arkansas, Arizona State, Auburn. Just amazing player who had a really good senior campaign in high school. If there is, along with Luke Wafel, a player who is a freshman on this line that has a chance to be an immediate impact player, I would look to him. I mean, offers from Georgia, Michigan, Oklahoma, Texas, and Kenny Baker were recruiting him. Washington was recruiting him. And he had a pretty sizable offer list here. I'm excited to see what he can do as a true freshman along with Luke Wafel. Ultimately for USC, the grades that I have assigned for each position are what I think those positions will be this season. I think the defensive line will be the best position, and I think it has the best potential, clearly. When looking at the talent of this defense, think that linebacker is a bit lacking in both proven production and ideal talent from a starting level. At all levels, when you look at freshmen, USC's recruited well enough in the younger classes. We're down the road. They'll have ideal talent if they properly develop. Corner and safety's okay there, but they leave a little bit more to be desired. D-line, it's all about development, because with how they've recruited on the D-line and how they've retained talent there are very few teams that have a higher ceiling on the defensive line than USC. USC was pretty atrocious in most parts of the defense last year. Good for a Grinch defense, bad for a blue blood level defense. The D-line is going to have to take a step up if they want to do a better job stopping the run, if they want to get better pressure, and if they want to maybe hide some of the areas in which they lack in the defensive backfield. That's why I believe this defensive line is one of the more critical units to follow throughout the season, because it's the most important part of USC's team, in my opinion, for deciding how the season pans out and how year one of Gary Patterson looks. Had a pretty big itch in my nose there. Don't exactly know why, but good thing I was able to hold off until we were done. Okay, so someone has a question for me. Hey, Sam, quick question, as I'm a new viewer. This is Rye D Sauce 4146. You said you weren't the biggest On3 fan. Why is that? Well, I like their portal rankings, and there is a place for them because they do break news, and they do a, honestly pretty good job at that. My issue with them is they are buying up the entire content space, pretty much. Ruffino and Joe Show is one of the few shows that has a decent presence, along with my own, along with Menace to Sports, and other ones that are like far, far bigger. But I was just mentioning shows that mostly cover exclusively college football or close to it that haven't been bought up or partnered with On3. So Crane and Company does, Josh Pate does, Andy and Ari do. Trying to think of any others, but they have a lot of like insiders that partner with them and have their own team themed shows. I think monopolies can sometimes be bad, and it feels like they have a huge monopoly in the content space right now. Oh, JD Pickell is a part of their show too. And I think that they try to engagement bait a lot. And look, to a certain degree you have to. Like with YouTube titles, you want to curate those to the algorithm as much as possible. You want to make sure you can get your stuff out there. You don't want to have clickbaity titles that are misleading, but if you have a clickbaity title that is not misleading and it's just attention grabbing, that's perfectly fine, in my opinion. In fact, it's probably necessary to succeed on YouTube. Just is what it is. But I get a lot of misleading stuff or just narrative pushing that I don't like. RJ Young is another one who wasn't a part of On3. He's partnered with Fox. And I don't know. It seems like a network of people who are mostly trying to cover the sport in the same way. And there's just so much. I should make a detailed video on why I don't think they're good for the sport, because there are some good people who I think work for them, and there are some good content from them. And I use their portal and recruiting rankings because I actually think they do a pretty good job there. But just a lot of the insider culture things, some of the bad predictions that are given out, or trying to make sure every fan base is pleased, which ideally I'd try to please every fan base, but I try to care about that as least as possible because you can't please everyone. It's impossible. So that's why I don't really like On3. I don't like monopolies, and I don't like monopolies that like try so hard to say they're the best in the business. And I just think when you look at the content that they produce, that no, they're not. They're not. There are many smaller creators I know that produce better analysis, and the analysis is what should count. Even some of their graphics aren't the best, with the exception of Pate. Pate's graphics team is phenomenal. Like, everything about his show, from an aesthetic standpoint, from a relatability standpoint, is pretty spot on. But there's just a lot that I don't like about that network. As for other content, going to talk about a few more things before we get out of here. First and foremost, why I'm selling Lane Kiffin. Bless me there. Why I'm selling Lane Kiffin in LSU stock. Lane Kiffin made the right decision to go to LSU. And I do think that he will have more success there than Brian Kelly did. But the standard at LSU, and ultimately what has defined success or failure at LSU as a head coach over their past few coaching hires, Nick Saban, Les Miles, Ed Orgeron, Brian Kelly, is whether or not you win a national title. That's what defines it. Les Miles even did that and made another appearance in a national title game, and he got fired. He didn't even decide when he wanted to leave, like Nick Saban, his predecessor at LSU, did. That is what determines success or failure at LSU. And why I'm selling Lane Kiffin in LSU stock, why I want you to watch this video and listen and hear me out, is, do you really think that Lane Kiffin is going to win a national title at LSU? Because I think he's better than Brian Kelly. I know he's better than Brian Kelly, especially for this era. But I think the hype is getting to be a bit much here. Just a little bit much. The recruiting, it's been good. I mean, when you look at combined high school and portal rankings, when you look at recruiting rankings, period, they have signed pretty good classes. Now, have they always been perfect under Kelly? No. And Kelly was a bit lazy in some things regarding NIL and initially lazy with the transfer portal too, and that played into his downfall. But still, they were recruiting at a top 15 level every year, and many years they were recruiting at a top 10 level, especially in terms of quality. They won 10 games in back-to-back seasons in 2022 and 2023. The 23 season with an all-time offense was ruined by an all-time bad defense. 2024, they went 9-4. Last year, they went 7-6. And in the middle of the season, when I believe they were, 4-3, 5-3, maybe even 5-4 or something, they fired Brian Kelly, and they were out on him. That was deserved. You cannot win 7 games at LSU or 8 games. You cannot get hosed by Texas A&M at home if you're LSU. You cannot have the dysfunction on offense that they've had over the past 2 seasons, and before that, the dysfunction on defense. In 4 years at LSU, you cannot have never fielded a complete team and survive. It's ridiculous. LSU is not a historical blue blood, but they should act like they are. And in hiring Kiffin, I think that they were trying to do the right thing. And they are going to have some successful years with Kiffin. Kiffin will get them to the 12-team playoff, which Brian Kelly never did. There's a decent chance, given last year's Ole Miss team, I know without him, but still that was a team he built and constructed, with that staff that he built and constructed, they reached the semifinals. So there's a decent chance that with Lane Kiffin, LSU reaches the semifinals, or maybe even the Natty. But every time you advance further in the playoffs, it gets that much harder to continue to win and win and win and win. You need to be an assassin in big games. You ought to be. You have to be. And Kelly was never that at Notre Dame, nor at LSU, nor at Cincinnati. He's a great program builder who won most of the games that he should have, with the exception of 2016, and I think with the exception of some games last year and even some contests in 2022. Like with Jaden Daniels, they should have beaten Florida State, for example, that season. And they should have performed better than they did in 2023 because they had no business having a defense that bad. However, when you look at Lane Kiffin in LSU, Lane Kiffin's primary thing at Ole Miss was building the program and building it up to have its most successful run ever via the portal, some underrated high school recruiting, honestly some pretty underrated development. But what did he do in the big games? In his second year at Ole Miss, where they went 10-3 and were honestly a pretty good team, it's good to pair records with FPI scores and power ratings. In 2021, Ole Miss was 18th in FPI, 10-3. They overachieved relative to who they were. In 2022, in 21 they lost to Alabama, they lost to Auburn, they beat a fairly overvalued A&M team, they lost to Baylor in the Sugar Bowl when Matt Corral did not opt out. In 2022 they started out 7-0 and then went on a 1-5 run, losing to LSU in a blowout, losing to Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi State, and Texas Tech. That season, Ole Miss was also 18th in FPI. They just happened to lose more games, but were a similar quality team. In 2023, Ole Miss was 15th in FPI. And in that season, they did beat LSU by 6 points in a shootout, but they lost to Alabama by double digits and to Georgia by double digits, and they beat a Penn State team with a bunch of opt-outs in the Peach Bowl. In 2024, they're 4th in FPI, or 5th. Fifth. 4th in efficiency. They're 10-3, with a schedule whose only teams that finish ranked at the end of the year are Georgia, and not even LSU finished ranked. Georgia was the only team that finished ranked at the end of the year. And they beat them, and they beat them 28-10. They beat them pretty good. It was Kiffin's best win of his career. One problem, though. They lost to Kentucky at home, who finished with a losing record. They lost to Florida, who had Billy Napier as their head coach, who was probably the second worst Power 4 coach at the time, only ahead of Sharon Moore. And they lost to LSU on the road, an LSU team that was not very good that year. They beat a good Georgia team, who, by the way, according to FPI and talent and efficiency, they should have beaten. But they lost to LSU, Florida, and Kentucky, who were all outside of the top 15 in FPI. So you get the one big win, but you snub yourself out of the college football playoff with some pretty atrocious losses. Last season, they would have made the playoff, but he bolted for LSU after Kelly got fired. They beat LSU, who at the time was ranked high, but LSU finished 7-6, so they weren't that good. They lost to Georgia competitively, but still lost to them. Their big win of the year under Kiffin was really Oklahoma on the road, who was 10-3, but only 15th in FPI. And their second win over Georgia in the period from the COVID year to 2025 came under Pete Golding. You can't really credit Lane Kiffin with that win. Exactly. So in many years at Ole Miss, he's only had one big win, and I understand he hasn't had the talent edge that many other programs he's played, like Alabama or Georgia, have had, but he also had talent edges over Kentucky, or over Florida, or Arkansas, or Mississippi State, or, and he hasn't exactly won all of those games either. And when you look at Ole Miss last year and Georgia the year before, they were pretty comparable in power ratings. They were. Alabama in 2023 was not dramatically better than Ole Miss that year. You saw that when they played, and also when they played in the postseason or played throughout the year. So even with the elite portal class, which I do believe was elite, LSU was one of the winners of the preseason, and even with all the talent they have coming in, coaching matters. And do we really put all of our stock in Sam Leavitt and those portal players in year one when Kiffin is preaching patience? Do we really put stock in them to have such a good roster that they could go on a playoff run, or that they could be dominant right out of the gate, even with a coach that, look, has a similar resume to James Franklin in big games? He does. What's his big win at Ole Miss? Sort of that one Georgia win at home, where Georgia was banged up, they were at home, and Ole Miss had their best roster in school history. Like the 2024 Ole Miss team would be favored over 2025 Ole Miss by a touchdown or even double digits. There was a huge gap in quality between those two teams. 2025 just won more games, and therefore was in the playoff picture. But they were not the same caliber of team, and I will die on that hill. Is this LSU roster better than that Ole Miss roster? I don't think so. I don't. I think that they're similar at O-line and running back, or LSU's probably a little bit better at running back than that Ole Miss team was, but O-line and running back were the weakness of that Ole Miss team. I don't think Leavitt right now is final year Jackson Dart. I don't think that they have like a Trey Harris at wide receiver there. They have a really good tight end in Trey'Dez Green, who I love and have as a possible first-round pick. In the secondary, they're probably better in parts, but I don't think they have a Walter Nolan at D-tackle. I don't think they have an Ivy at defensive end at D-tackle. They don't have the D-line that Ole Miss team did. And Leavitt was injured last year. And when I do my research and saw the amount of players that LSU brought in and how good they were, there were a lot of good players. They have even some potential aliens. They didn't bring in a Cam Coleman. They didn't bring in a... How do I put this? They didn't bring in a lot of players who in year one are going to jump out and just dominate you. They didn't do that. A lot of the players that have that potential, in my opinion, DJ Pickett, PJ Woodland, Deshaun Spears, I'm unbelievably high on that secondary. They have all the necessary measurables. They have all of the talent in the world, and they got good coaching with that staff under Blake Baker. Brycen Moore at center, maybe Sam Levitt if healthy at quarterback, but health is a question mark, and then Travis Green at tight end. A lot of their best players are holdovers from the prior regime, who were recruited by that regime, developed by them for a year, so on and so forth. And I trust Kiffin to get offense correct, and I trust Baker to do okay enough or well enough defensively where they're not going to be terrible there. But this is LSU. We're talking about in year one a team that has basically CFP or bust expectations, and down the road will have national title or bust expectations. I view Blake Baker as a probably top 20, top 15 defensive coordinator. I think that he's a bit overvalued in national circles, but I think he's pretty good. Last year he was really impressive with what he did, given the ineptitude on offense for LSU. Charlie Weiss Jr. and Lane Kiffin are some of the best offensive minds in the sport. So right now you have one of the better staffs in the SEC, and they should make the playoffs. And they have one of the better rosters in the SEC too. I mean, they are a playoff contender in year one, and I will say, if enough goes right for them this year, they could even be a national title contender. They need some things to fall their way in a way that, in my mind, Ohio State, Oregon, Notre Dame, Texas, Ohio State, and Indiana don't need to fall in their way to be title contenders. Those are my top 6. But I have LSU as a top 15 team, and I think they're closer to being the 10th best team than the 15th best team. But I'm selling this stock not really because of this season. I explained a bit why I wouldn't go all in on them this year, but that's not really the point. I mean, if you're picking LSU to do anything that does not factor in them beating some of my top teams and winning it all, I'm fine with you picking them to do pretty much anything else. Like, okay, maybe they beat Georgia in a one-off game, or they win 2 or 3 playoff games and are in the semifinals or even in the national title if the bracket goes right and they avoid Oregon or they avoid Texas, or maybe they beat Texas in the regular season, which would be pretty bold, but possible. I'm talking about the long run here. That's what I'm discussing. And that's the stock that I'm selling, because so many people, whether Clay Travis, whether Josh Pate, or a lot of different media types, J.D. Pickell, or really anyone you could talk to, they love this idea. And it is a cool idea. You get a maverick, you get someone with very eccentric personality traits and eccentric coaching traits, and you put them at a university that's full of eccentricities in LSU. And boom, you kind of have a villainous story, although Texas Tech is now, okay, hey, Lane Kiffin, LSU, let me raise you one. You have no ability to match the villainy we have with the whole Sorsby story. And then they down like the whole bottle of wine in 10 seconds. I'm talking about the long term here. At Ole Miss, he won 75% of his games, 55-19. And he has better talent at LSU, so that should translate. At least, if anything, it should improve, and he should be in the 80s. My question is, and I think that Cignetti has taught me this. I think that Kirby Smart over the past 2 years has taught me this. I think that, honestly, you know what? Like, if Ryan Day had to restart and go somewhere else, I think he would be teaching me this. Talent helps, but coaching is what matters most. Still in college football. The players only matter more than the coaches because they're playing the sport and there's more of them than there are coaches. And they're actually catching the ball, they're throwing the football. But a bad coach, unless he has good assistants or a fantastic roster, like LSU, they did not have a good head coach. They had a wonderful DC, and they had Joe Brady, who's now the head coach of the Buffalo Bills. Like, they had a good staff, they just didn't have a good head coach. 2001 Miami had a wonderful staff develop that roster. Then Coker took it over, and it was so wonderfully developed by the prior regime, it took him years to ruin it. It took a while. Who you are is who you are, is my point. Cignetti won a natty with that BCR. Like a BCR in the single digits. That indicates someone special right there. That's why even with his small sample size, he's anywhere from head coach number 3 to number 1, no matter where you look. He is special. There is something unique about him and his staff where he just wins at that clip. I don't know if he'll always win 92% of his games. I'd say that's incredibly unlikely, but he's probably going to be an 80 to 90% win-loss record coach. And who knows, maybe he could be the best coach of all time if this continues, or the best behind Nick Saban. We don't know that yet. We do have a larger sample on Kiffin, though. We've seen Kiffin at USC. We've seen him at Tennessee. We've seen him at LSU or at Ole Miss. And we're already seeing how he's acting at LSU, preaching caution, despite having one of the largest budgets and possibly the largest budget in the SEC to operate with. At Ole Miss, he never won the SEC. He never won a playoff game. He was 1-1 in New Year's 6 games. He was 4-7 versus the top 10. And when you take a look at power ratings and not AP poll or coaches poll rankings, he only had one win against the FPI top 10 in the regular season in that time frame, which is the same as James Franklin at Penn State. I don't know what to tell you guys. And he has 10 losses versus unranked teams. Never beat Alabama, was 1-1 versus Georgia, and that one Georgia win was really good. But that Ole Miss roster was also the best roster that he's maybe ever had outside of, maybe in terms of talent, one of his USC rosters, and that was a total disaster. I think he's a better coach now than he was then, but there are questions about who he is as a coach. You cannot have him top 5. You cannot have him ahead of Lanning. You cannot have him ahead of Marcus Freeman. You can't have him ahead of Cignetti, of Day, of Smart. At the very best, you're looking at the 6th best coach in America. At the very, very, very best. And I would challenge people who have him higher than that in, do you really think he's better than Kalen DeBoer? Because Kalen DeBoer's won a 4-team playoff game and a 12-team playoff game. Yeah, and has won a conference title and has reached the SEC title game with a much tougher schedule than Kiffin's ever had at LSU. Like, he's not better than Kalen DeBoer. I don't even think he's better than Steve Sarkisian. Sarkisian inherited a mess at Texas. A mess. And has built one of the most talented rosters in the sport and has held on to that. And to his credit, in his previous few seasons, he's had some bad losses, like to Florida last year. But that's the only bad loss that he's really had. Kiffin also lost to a Billy Napier team and has lost, over the past 2 seasons, triple the amount of games to small teams that Texas has lost in the previous 3 seasons. So when you factor that in, that he's not a top 5 coach, and usually it's the top 5 coaches that win it all. And if not, they usually have, again, electric staffs and the best roster in the sport. LSU in 19 had the best roster in the sport. Miami in 2001 had the best roster in the sport. And every other example that I can... Gene Chizik, 2010 Auburn. Best QB in the sport. Such a good QB, so above all other QBs. And he had Ted Roof, who at the time was a good DC, and Gus Malzahn at the time was an electric, innovative offensive coordinator. You need a lot to win it all. A lot. And this narrative that, you can win it all with a bad head coach is only true if the bad head coach happens to make good staff hires or lucks himself into making good staff hires. And that's going to be harder now because you're going to have to evaluate harder and scout harder and recruit harder than ever before. You are going to have to make more critical in-game decisions because the clock rules are shorter, so there's more of an opportunity for close contests. And the 2019 LSU roster, the 2001 Miami roster, will not exist anymore. You will not have a team that deep. You will not have a team that has the potential to have QB 1 and wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 in the NFL. anymore, on top of having some loaded players at other positions, including on defense. You won't have that anymore. So you can't rely on that to compensate for coaching. I don't think Kiffin is as bad as Ed Orgeron or Larry Coker. Make no mistake about it. But also look at his track record here. At the Raiders, 2 seasons. Tennessee, 1 season. USC, 10, 11, 12, 13, 4 seasons. OC at Alabama, and he didn't even leave for FAU. He got fired by Nick Saban before the national title game. Only there for 3 seasons. Possibly cost them a natty with his play calling against Ohio State where he didn't run Derrick Henry. FAU was there for 3 seasons. Ole Miss, 20, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Only there for 6. Then left for LSU. I'm just saying, when looking at him and his track record and what I see out of a coach, I don't like the fit long term. Short term, there could absolutely be some benefits. But long term, I don't know. You got to win a national title at LSU to have success, or they will push you out. It's what happened with Miles. They were trying to push out Miles before he totally imploded. And when you no longer have booster backing and alignment, the win and loss record's going to get worse because you're no longer recruiting at the same level, or your mind is split between multiple things and tasks. And I don't know. I think that, I think that this is going to be a fun experiment. I believe LSU this year is going to win 8, 9, or 10 games, not less. They could win more. I could see LSU going 12-0 this year. Probably wouldn't win it all at 12-0, though, unless they were clearly the number 1 power-rated team, given coaching Kiffin's history coaching, and also given the fact that if they weren't number 1 and went 12-0 with the schedule, they'd probably have some close wins that would suggest their winning would be a bit unsustainable. But they have that ceiling. I just, when I look at it here, I think that this year, next year, and maybe the following few years, like the first 4 at the very most, is going to be a bit funny. It's going to be fun, and there's going to be exciting times, and there's going to be that feeling of we're so close. But over time, if what he's done in his past is replicated, he's not going to win enough big games to keep the people in the Bayou happy. And with the toughness of SEC schedules and the fact that, look, LSU kind of won the scheduling lottery this year in the SEC, if he faces a tougher schedule and has a year where, say, there's a ton of big games in the schedule and he only wins one of them and they're out of the playoffs, you're going to start to see his name on the hot seat again. I do not like that he is preaching caution. I think him preaching caution is him saying he thinks there are limitations at LSU, and if that's true, and I'm inclined to believe there is with him at the helm, people are going to get mad there pretty quickly because they don't believe in limitations at LSU. And with how before Kelly, their previous 3 coaches won at least 1 national title, I kind of relate to that. Okay, I wanted to cover more, but we've gotten through 7 segments in about 2 hours time here, which is pretty good time. And I don't feel like I'm at my best today. So we are going to push back the bold prediction, and we're going to push back some other things to tomorrow. We have 30 concurrent viewers and likes. That's pretty incredible. Just seeing if there's any comments about LSU or anything. Doesn't really look like it. Doesn't really look like it. Yeah. We are actually no. We're gonna finish out with these 2. We've been pretty good on time. I am tired. Don't feel like I'm at my best today, but we're gonna finish out with this. That way, that the next few shows are actually pretty good. Sorry for the late change. We probably had some. Well, it actually doesn't look like we had viewers drop off, so that's good. We're gonna quickly talk about why I'm buying the Big Ten, and then talk very quickly about a UCLA bold prediction. I'm buying the Big Ten in 2026 and beyond, and here's why. Their depth is about to rise to a level of the SEC, or what some would say the SEC claims to have. The Big Ten has the best coaching in the sport. They have the biggest financial backers of the sport. And they've won the past 3 national championships. And while I don't think they're going to go on this run where they win the national title every year for the next 10 years, I believe that this conference is going to get deeper, better, bigger, and stronger over time. They can outspend the SEC. They have shown for years now that they can outcoach the SEC. And I think those 2 points are obvious when comparing them to the Big 12 or to the ACC. When I look at the Big Ten, the amount of teams that they have in the top 35 of returning production is impressive. They got Maryland, Nebraska, Minnesota, UCLA, and Wisconsin. The other teams that are in there we'll talk about in a few seconds because they're bigger teams. A lot of their lower-end teams, Maryland, Nebraska, Minnesota, UCLA, are returning or bringing in quite a bit of production, which means they will likely improve. And from a power ratings angle, I pretty much agree. I think that all of these teams, with the exception of one, because there's usually one team that returns a lot of production that totally busts. I happen to think that's going to be Maryland this year, but I could very much be wrong. I think you're going to see the lower end of the Big Ten rise up by a few feet, or maybe even by a few yards. I believe that your range of teams in the Big Ten in terms of power ratings is going to compress, but instead of compressing towards the bottom, as in the top teams are getting worse, it's going to compress more like that way. I think that the top of the Big Ten could actually be a little bit better than it was last year. I think it's going to be pretty similar, as I believe Oregon will be the best team. Indiana, Ohio State will also be top 5, top 4 teams. But the bottom is going to be better. Purdue or Michigan State will be the worst Big Ten team this year, as they were last year, and they will be better than their counterparts were last year. Maryland, I have only winning 2 games because I think Franklin's going to go in there with Virginia Tech and bomb them. And I think after a bit of losing, which Maryland has had a history of doing over the past 2 years, I think the team's going to quit and Loxley will be fired. But if I'm wrong about that, this Maryland team will be better than last year's team due to just how much they return. I think they tried to make some coaching staff upgrades. I also do believe, though, that by the messaging of the Maryland program, they're going to be out on him if he does not go bowling or win 7 games this season. Nebraska, Minnesota, and especially UCLA, I'm sold on them improving. I'm also not really sold on Wisconsin improving, but I think it's highly unlikely that both Maryland and Wisconsin totally collapse. I actually think it could even be likely that both get fired, but collapsing versus getting fired at the end of the year is different. I do have Wisconsin improving. I also have Northwestern and Purdue improving. And then at the top of the Big Ten, Oregon, USC, Washington, Michigan, and Ohio State returned 60% of their production last year or more. I have all of those teams power rated inside my top 15. So from a power ratings and depth angle, from a capability of winning a national title angle, I'm very high in the Big Ten this year. But I want to go through some of these teams for a minute or so each and discuss what I view their program as. And for context, you've seen the returning production numbers, so here are some analytics from how they performed last season. Those 2 things combined should at least give you a decent understanding of what to expect from this team this year. For context, Indiana's win total this year is 10.5. It's juiced to the over. For now, I have Indiana picked as my Big Ten champion, and I do have them as the national runner-up in the playoff. So, yeah, have them beating Ohio State, beating Michigan. I believe that Cignetti is going to once again put on a coaching masterpiece this year and field a fantastic team. I'm buying Indiana in the long run. I've said it in a prior video. They're going to win more titles, plural, under Cignetti. Big Ten titles, at least one more national title, maybe more national titles. They're only getting more talented over time. They're invested in football, and to have a 27-2 record with that lack of 4- and 5-star talent is not flukish. It's not, because they didn't do it by winning close games. They did it mostly by blowing out a plethora of teams that were more talented than them and coaching circles around them and executing at a high level. All of those things are sustainable, and even the biggest critic of Indiana this year, even they, if they are honest with themselves, will tell you that if they're being critical of Indiana this year, they cannot be critical of Indiana in the long run because they're only going to get more talented. And what they did last year in 2024 is sustainable. Not in an exact way, like they'll go 16-0 every year, but in a way where they will always be in that college football playoff race. And from here on out, there will be several years, if not every year, they'll be in the national title race. F. Cignetti also is the best coach in college football, and it sounds like he's going to be around Indiana for quite some time. Ohio State is the best program in college football right now and in the Big Ten. Indiana and Oregon are competing with them for that. I really determined who was my best program by taking the average power rating of the past 2 years, wins and losses, wins in big games, sprinkling in a little bit of recruiting and NIL. And with the recruiting and NIL and power rating aspect, Ohio State just barely edged out Indiana for an average over the past 2 seasons. Look, Ryan Day is an elite coach. He is probably going to win another natty at Ohio State. I would like to venture, and I happen to think he's going to be around there for quite some time. It doesn't matter who his coordinators are, seemingly, or his assistants. Doesn't matter the type of team he has. They're always a national title contender. And in 2024, they won a national title. I have Ohio State right now winning 10 regular season games with, I would say, the toughest schedule in America. They will split their coin flip games. They will beat all the teams they should beat. They will win at least a playoff game. They will be a threat to win it all at the end of the season. And there is a very good chance they could win the Big Ten. I happen to have them not doing so, but that's because I believe Indiana and Oregon have easier schedules and therefore an easier path to Indy. So for this season and moving forward, I'm also high on Ohio State. And I think that while I've said in the past, I don't believe they will have the same loaded teams that they've had the previous 2 seasons, being what Georgia has been the past 2 seasons, where you're still a title contender, you're just not as dominant, is a fantastic place to be. And in terms of sustainability and in terms of ceilings and floors, I mean, that's not very different from what Indiana has had last year. I mean, last season's Indiana team was damn good. It was the most impressive national title team ever. That was not a team that had outer worldly talent. They had weaknesses. Ohio State's going to be a national title contender every year, even after Jeremiah Smith leaves, even with Caleb Downs, Arvell Reese, and Sonny Styles leaving. I have no concerns about whether or not they will or won't reload. They're going to. Indiana will. And Oregon, whether or not they get it done this year, will as well. Oregon has elite recruiting nailed. They have elite development almost nailed. The one thing they are missing is the big game coaching. And even then, Lanning is basically 500 in games against the FPI top 10. So he's not James Franklin. He has more pre-college football playoff top 10 wins than Franklin does, beating Ohio State and Penn State in the same season in 2024, and also beating Utah in 2022, who was power rated top 10 per FPI. And last season, at the time they beat Penn State, they were top 10 FPI. I know they didn't finish that way, but USC, Iowa, and Penn State all did, and they beat all 3 of them, and 2 of them were on the road. So I think he can win big games. And I know after this season they will lose quite a bit. Their entire starting D-line, Dante Moore, probably Jamari Johnson, their center, Iapani Lololu. And yet their 2 best players in the team might be underclassmen who come back next year, and Decorian Moore and Brandon Finney. Nasir Wyatt, who won't be draft eligible, is going to be a phenomenal DN this year and a phenomenal starter for them in 2027. They have signed the top recruiting class in back-to-back seasons in terms of average rank per recruit. And the way they've put players in the league the past 2-3 years indicates that they know how to develop, they know how to retain players, to nurture them. And Dan Lanning is only getting better on defense at Oregon as the seasons go on. Last season, they entered the season only returning 40-something% of their production from 2025, and they got better. It's an unbelievable feat. He had one of the best reloading jobs last year, and I would expect Oregon this season to compete for a national title. I have them winning the national title right now. They're going to be the Big Ten runner-ups to Indiana. I love this team. I do. And I love the program moving forward. I mean, you have Indiana, Ohio State, and Oregon. And there is an argument that those are the three best programs now. There's an argument that those are the three best programs moving forward in college football. Some other teams that factor into why I'm buying the Big Ten in the long term. Let's start off with USC. They signed the number one class. That can be important, but ultimately they need to develop to parlay that. What I like with USC is the NIL involvement. So even if Riley completely fails and they have to get someone new, they'll get someone new, and if they believe in him, they'll completely back him, and if he's the right guy, then the sleeping giant's unlocked. What they have in this current era will make them one of the best jobs in college football. You could even make an argument for it could be the best job in college football with how they were able to sign that class. And USC has high expectations, but they don't quite yet have Ohio State, Texas expectations yet. They don't. They'll need to win more before having those expectations again. So it's a fantastic job, and I think Riley's a good coach. Lincoln Riley was overrated a few years ago. I'm starting to believe that he is a bit underrated, I would say. Why? Well, he's been willing to change. That's a sign of a good coach. He still has his offensive finesse, as you saw last season. USC's recruiting at a higher level, and their lines of scrimmage play has been its best ever under Riley, I would say, as of last season at USC. And I think in terms of holding on to key players and letting go of players that they didn't need, such as Deuce Robinson, they've made some pretty good general manager level decisions. So if Riley is able to fix defense, this is going to be a yearly national title contender. If not, he'll eventually get fired, but someone new will come in at USC and have a really good time building that team and having success. Michigan is a bit of a different story here. They have Kyle Whittingham in year one. Kyle Whittingham is viewed by many as more of a temporary hire. But you know what? I don't really care that much. You know, if they can get the best out of Bryce Underwood, if they can bring Jay Hill's defense to Michigan, if they can bring Jim Harding's O-line coaching to Michigan, it won't matter if he's only here for 5 years. They'll probably have a season or two where they're competing for it all, with how they recruit, with how Whittingham and his staff have developed, and the players that they have coming back. I'm not as high on Michigan or even USC as I am in the long run as, say, obviously Indiana, Ohio State, and Oregon, but I believe these two are going to be top 10 programs in the next few seasons and have seasons where they win a playoff game or two and be consistent college football playoff contenders. I am bullish on the long-term outlook when you look at Michigan and USC's spending. And with Michigan in particular, Whittingham does not have the coaching acumen questions that Riley does. Riley's never figured out defense in his career. Whittingham has figured out offense despite being a defensive guy, and he's pretty much always had top 25 defenses with top 30 talent. You translate that to Michigan, and Michigan should probably always have top 15 or top 10 defenses under his reign, and there could be some seasons where they upcycle and have a top 5 defense. Jason Beck, his offensive coordinator, has always had offenses that improved compared to the prior season when he got there. So how I view the Big Ten with these top 5 is you have 5 programs who can compete on 3 of them on an annual basis, maybe even 5 if USC and Michigan step up. If they don't step up to the degree that I think they can, on probably a semi-annual basis or inconsistent basis, they'll still compete for natties with the talent and spending that they have. Iowa's a bit different than this, but Iowa with Kirk Ferentz, as long as he's there, will always be reliable. They'll always be 8-4. They'll probably always be power rated top 25 or top 20. And with Tim Lester as their OC, they'll continue to improve on the offensive side of the football. LeVar Woods leaving is a bit of a concern for me because he was so big for that program. But they kept Phil Parker, they kept their other assistants, and they keep improving on the offensive side of the football. So that adds depth to the conference. Iowa is essentially a depth piece to the conference. As of right now, I would also say Washington is too. But Washington fielded a very underrated defense last year. They were really good at stopping the run. They were okay at stopping the pass, but they had to face Oregon. They had to face Ohio State, some of the better passing offenses they were going to play all season long. And offensively, they were good enough, and that was in year 2 of the Jedd Fisch era. As of right now, Washington's simply a depth piece, but they can be a playoff contender this year. And after they just signed a top 15 recruiting class, if they can retain talent as they were able to retain DeMond Williams, and they're able to get more involved in the spending space, continue to develop and nurture talent, they could maybe compete for a title. They've done it before under DeBoer. They did it before under Chris Peterson. Why can't Washington, a historic program, do the same under Jedd Fisch? And last but not least, the worst team of this group last year in terms of win-loss record. They were actually better than Michigan, Washington, and Iowa when you look at power ratings still, which is funny. It's Penn State. I mean, what if Penn State reemerges under Matt Campbell? They're not quite recruiting at a James Franklin level right now, but they're recruiting at a better level than Campbell ever could at Iowa State. And Campbell's a coach who's always been known to do more with less. They've always been known to do more with less. So when I look at Penn State here, if Campbell can introduce a secret sauce where his win-loss record and his performance correlates with a 40 to 50% blue chip ratio in terms of winning big compared to other schools who need maybe 60 or 70% to win big, then Penn State will be just fine. And they'll be competing for Big Ten titles and college football playoff spots maybe after a year or two of Campbell resetting the foundation, building the foundation, and adding depth to the program. I loved that hire by Penn State. You look at the Big Ten title odds, and there is a clear tier right now, but a lot of that has to do with scheduling and the fact that USC and Michigan have tougher schedules, much tougher schedules than Indiana or Oregon. Ohio State's still the overwhelming favorite, despite having, I think, the nation's toughest schedule, but that is because millionaire professional bettors will bet Ohio State pretty much over everyone. So that's essentially Nick Saban, Alabama level benefit of the doubt. And while I do have Ohio State as my number one program, they're not Nick Saban, Alabama. So the odds are probably closer together than the sports books would have it. Like Ohio State's probably a bit overvalued in Big Ten title odds, and not just a little, but a bit. I think Indiana and even maybe Oregon a little bit could at least be a little bit overvalued there, if not properly priced. There's probably value on USC there. I think USC and maybe, depending on how some things pan out, even a Michigan could be underrated in terms of Big Ten conference title odds. In the national picture, I do have them as underrated. There are several SEC teams, LSU, A&M, and Alabama, who are ahead of USC and Michigan in title odds. I think that Michigan and USC are actually better than those three teams, including Oklahoma. But those three, I will admit, Alabama, LSU, and, well, A&M I don't quite know, but Alabama and LSU do have easier schedules in my mind than Michigan and USC do. So I understand the difference in odds. Ohio State, though, is number one in odds to win it all, and Indiana and Oregon are top 5. So of your top contenders, the Big Ten has the most, and Penn State, Washington, USC, and Michigan are viewed respectably enough where the top 7 in the Big Ten is going to be pretty damn good this year. You probably have 7 Big Ten teams who will be power rated top 20 for sure in my research. Iowa could be that 8th in that group, and one of Nebraska, Minnesota, Wisconsin, UCLA, I think could pop off and be flirting with that. So that's why I'm buying the Big Ten in the long run. There's just too much depth, too much coaching acumen in the conference, too much talent, too much spending. Right now, I have 3 Big Ten coaches in my top 5 coaches. I have 4, maybe even 5 of them. I have to redo my initial rankings from the spring. But probably half of the top 10 coaches, or 4 out of 10, are in the Big Ten. And then you look at the top 20, and you probably have, I would say, 9 of the top 20 are from the Big Ten. 8 or 9 there. So that is just incredible. And you can call me biased for saying that, and maybe there is some. I think I'm pretty objective here. It's why I will defend Kirby Smart and even Nick Saban to death, even as a lot of Big Ten people hate them or think they're very overrated. It's not true. The Big Ten right now is better coaching. They have better assistants. I mean, Matt Patricia and Phil Parker are better defensive coordinators than anyone in the SEC outside of like Brent Venables and maybe Knowles. And Venables is a head coach DC. You add in Jay Hill, Ryan Walters, you add in Bryant Haynes, who I think is also up there with Phil Parker and Matt Patricia, and you have some of the best defensive minds in the sport in the Big Ten. And defense right now is the metagame, more so than offense, although obviously you need both at a high level to win titles. I'm buying the Big Ten. I encourage you to do so because with the spending disparity they have with the SEC, the longer there's chaos, the more that disparity will widen, and that will entrench Big Ten coaches. And since SEC coaches, fans, and administrations are not adjusting expectations, that's only going to put them under more pressure and cause them to have more turmoil. And I only mention them because they're the chief rival of the Big Ten right now. The ACC and Big 12 are not even close to the SEC or Big Ten at this moment. Okay. Gosh, I'm tired, but we have to get through this. I spent a long time on this. With UCLA, yeah, we can do this. Just going to go over some bold predictions for 2026, and a good friend of the show has one for me that I want to review. I was clearing my eyes there a bit. Great friend of the show, Rational Buckeye, friend of the show. You should follow him on Twitter. He has some pretty fantastic content over there. He gave me a bold prediction in my Discord server that says UCLA flirts with the college football playoff. Not makes it, but flirts with it. I'm going to loosely interpret flirting with the college football playoff as they have a chance to make it in the month of November, preferably mid-November. So UCLA is plus 1,900 to make the CFP. You can't bet on them to miss the CFP because they're so likely to miss it. But let's go through UCLA, who they are this year, their schedule. At the end, I will give a 1 to 10 rating of this prediction on a boldness scale, very Josh Pate-esque, and rate it on that scale to determine how bold this prediction is. Thank you, Rational Buckeye. Enjoy your work. Enjoy talking college football with you. Thank you for this prediction. If you want to make your bold prediction, have me review it, join my Discord server via the link in the description or pinned comment. Navigate to my YouTube mailbox channel and drop in a bold prediction that you have there. First and foremost, we have to take into account that UCLA this year is an older, stronger, beefier, more talented version of James Madison last year. They have some key players, such as Nico Iamaleava, who are retained from last year's team, and that also goes to the same with Sam Yoon, Roderick Pleasant, for example. Sammy Omosingo is a linebacker transfer from Oklahoma. So they have some other non-JMU transfers. But for the most part, this team has a lot of JMU kids, young adults, young men, coming from that program to this UCLA program. Same with Dean Kennedy, the offensive coordinator for UCLA. Same position at James Madison. Colin Hitchler, the DC at JMU, now DC at UCLA, and Bob Chesney, the head coach, the CEO and commander of this entire operation. Just a quick shout out to UCLA in terms of recruiting. Keep it up. It's fantastic what they're doing, that they have alignment there and have plenty of blue chippers, including, it looks like in recent updates, a potential 5-star in Juju Johnson. That's wild. Congratulations on that. To get back to the topic at hand, JMU was pretty damn good. They played an easy schedule, so EPA per play and success rate margin can get seduced by those things because they try to take into account strength of schedule, but it's very hard for those specific metrics to do so. Regardless of that, points per play margin, top 15. EPA per play and success rate margin, they were top 5. They were 10th in PFF rating, which again is a tough time taking into account strength of schedule. But metrics that do a much better job at taking strength of schedule into account, FEI, S&P+, FPI, efficiency, game control, had James Madison, even after the blowout loss to Oregon, as pretty much a top 30 team, top 35 team. So an above average to average Power 4 team is what James Madison was last year. The G5, I wish I could care about the G5 more. I just can't with the portal because they're a feeder league for the Power 4. So it's almost a waste of my time to care about them. But looking at probabilities and looking at FPI scores last year, James Madison was behind only, in terms of 2025 FPI, I was looking at the 2024 numbers, they were only behind South Florida in FPI. Only behind South Florida. So they were the second best G5 team. They were better than North Texas, and they were better than Tulane in power ratings. And when you look at efficiency scores, James Madison was actually, let me see here. Yeah, they were 4th. They were behind North Texas, Old Dominion, and South Florida in efficiency. They were 32nd there with a top 50 offense and a top 50 defense. So you're an average or above average Power 4 team. That means you are a great or possibly even elite Group of 5 team last year. That's very important given how many players transferred over. James Madison was excellent on defense, in particularly stopping the pass, also good at stopping the run. Obviously, Oregon showed that there were talent limitations and they couldn't scale, but that's Oregon. Oregon last year had the second best Big Ten offense, only behind Indiana. They had a top 5 offense. I'd say the only offense that was clearly better than theirs was Indiana. Vanderbilt, Georgia, and Notre Dame had arguments to be better than theirs, but that's a topic for another day. James Madison's offense with Alonzo Barnett, I think Nico is a better quarterback than he is, and definitely has higher upside, and there's a reason that staff kept him. But he got an offer to go to a Power 4 school, to sort of level up in terms of the caliber of opponent played. He's going to UCF, where he will be Scott Frost's starting quarterback. They had some pretty damn good players, like Sahir West, who led the team in sacks as a redshirt freshman. They had, obviously Alonzo Barnett, but Wayne Knight, great running back. Landon Ellis, great receiver. They had DJ Barksdale was a pretty good corner for them who transferred over. And I love this team. I love the makeup of it. So I don't believe that you're looking at something that's super duper bold here. I don't believe that. For James Madison, since we're looking at their spider chart, which this will probably be the only G5 spider chart that you will ever see, outside of maybe Oklahoma State's from North Texas last year, my grades for this spider chart were, usually my grades on these spider charts when I'm talking in the preseason are for this year's team, with the spider chart and stats from last year's team to build context for why I think the grades will be what they are when weaving in returning players. These are grades for what I thought James Madison was last season. I think that offensively they were pretty good. They were very underrated at running the ball. They were average at they were average, maybe above average at a college football level, including the G5 in passing and with tight end play. But their O-line, receivers, and rushing offense was above average or even good nationally. And you're bringing that over to a UCLA team that, yeah, they're going to be facing a tougher schedule now that they're in the Big Ten instead of the Sun Belt, but they're also going to have a better supporting cast, many of these JMU players will, and some better teammates of their own that they did not have last season. Landon Ellis is fantastic at wide receiver. Last year, Landon Ellis led his team, James Madison, in receiving yards. He had 624 with 5 receiving touchdowns. They also bring in Leland Smith from San Jose State, who had 688 receiving yards. They bring in a few players in terms of Carter Sweezy, Riley Robel from the offensive line at James Madison, where they were pretty good. Wayne Knight at James Madison at 1,373 rushing yards, 9 touchdowns, 6.6 yards per carry. Love what he has to offer UCLA and a rushing offense that will feature Nico Iamaleava this season, who had 505 rushing yards last year and 4 touchdowns. You take a look on defense, and I think the defense was the stronger side of the ball. Special teams was pretty meh. But defensively, this team, in terms of JMU players going to a bigger school, it does sort of remind me of Cignetti in Indiana. I don't think it'll even be close because I'm a big believer in the blue chip ratio, just not enough of a believer in it to think that Indiana could have never won it all. They did. So I think there's something special at Indiana that Chesney probably doesn't quite have. But in his own Walmart way, I think he's following that model, and it will work. Sahir West, just watching him, looking at his numbers, at 6'4", 270, he has the measurables, the height, and the production to translate 7 sacks and a forced fumble into the Big Ten. Maxwell Roy transfers in from Ohio State, where he redshirted. Now, redshirt freshman was buried in Ohio State's depth chart, but you don't need elite D tackle play if you're UCLA. You just need an improvement there. And you bring him in as someone to develop for a few seasons. Ohio State with Larry Johnson did a good job developing him, and he can probably give you some upside that other players on your team don't have. Aiden Gobira, he transfers in as a DN from James Madison, where he also previously played at Notre Dame. We already talked about Sammy Omoshingo. Drew Spigonati transfers in. This team in particular was really good at stopping the run. That was their strength, and third down defense. The weaker aspect of this team was the secondary, I believe, specifically at safety. And I think there is no coincidence in that when you see the fact that, like, DJ Barksdale's projected to start. They brought him in from James Madison. But there are other incoming transfers in the secondary. Dante Lovett, Tashawn James, who actually played quite a bit last year. That was a good pickup. Malik Hartford from Ohio State. And Teo Johnson. They were from Utah, Ohio State, Virginia Tech, and Iowa State. They were not from James Madison. The only one that was is the starting nickel, DJ Barksdale, who had 12 passes defended and 2 interceptions, 5'9", 181 pounds last year. When you look at this team and its build, you think, okay, they were an above-average team last year with all the production they're bringing in and all of the upgrades they have relative to last year's JMU team, plus keeping good UCLA players and bringing in some good players from other schools, whether backups or starters. You got to think they're going to improve, which means they'll be an above-average to good Power 4 team this year, which means you're looking at a team that's likely top 30 in power ratings, or top 35. That's a huge contrast from who UCLA was last year, where the Bruins were all the way down at, I'm going to have to scroll a while to find this, hold on. They were very low in efficiency. They were all the way down at, were they really that low? That would be insane. They were 90th in efficiency. 90th. They have the 87th best offense, 92nd best defense. They were only ahead of Purdue by 2 points in efficiency. That is how bad UCLA was. That's how bad Deshaun Foster bungled this whole thing. But when you look at On3's transfer portal score, you see that they had a lot of outgoing players and a lot of incoming players. So this year's team, as many of those incoming players are JMU players or some key transfers. And look, Roderick Pleasant, Nico Iamaleava were some of the better players on UCLA last season. this team is going to be totally different from last season's UCLA team. So I think we can establish that this is certainly not a 10. It's certainly not a 1 or a 2 either on the boldness scale. Because it's UCLA, they're playing a Big Ten schedule, and James Madison was not dominant enough at the G5 level to say they're immediately going to translate to the Big Ten and have success. Well, I think their coordinators are good and were great relative to the G5 level in Dean Kennedy and Hitchler, and I already have Chesney as a fringe top 25 head coach nationally, which should show you the respect that I have for him. I don't think their staff is going to be quite as dominant as Indiana's, or that it will immediately be one of the best in the Big Ten. It will immediately be in the top half, though, I think, of the Big Ten. And that's with a very deep conference of coaching. So that means you're looking at a team that immediately can beat the scrubs, can beat most of the G5 teams that they play in the non-conference, and their schedule is workable. At Cal, that's going to be tough, playing Jaron Kiwi Sagapola Tele. It's going to be tough playing at Maryland. It's going to be tough playing at Oregon. Tough playing at Minnesota, at Michigan, and USC at home. But look at San Diego State. That's a win with this team. Purdue at home with that travel, that's probably a win. Wisconsin at home with that travel, that's probably a win. Michigan State at home, again, travel. And the fact that JMU has had better players than Michigan State does this year and UCLA does, that's probably a win. Nevada at home is a win. Illinois at home with that travel at that time of night is probably a win. You're looking at 6 wins right off the bat here. Right off the bat. So the question is, can they beat one of Cal or a handful of Cal, Maryland, Oregon, Minnesota? Because I think the criteria for this prediction to hit is entering the Michigan game, they only have 2 losses. That's the criteria. 9-3 UCLA with this schedule is not getting in. So by the time you get to Michigan, you have to have 2 or fewer losses in order to be flirting with this college football playoff. That's going to be my criteria. In your first 10 games, you have to go 8-2. So what's the likelihood of that? Well, their win total's at 6.5. They're probably going to be around a 10-point underdog to Michigan on the road because it's cross-country travel. It's before the USC game. Michigan has much better players, and to this point, a more proven coaching staff. USC will probably be favored over them by about a touchdown or more. So those are unlikely. If you take those out of the win total, and it was simply a 10-game schedule without those games on it, you're probably looking at more of a 7.5 win total. It's probably what you're looking at there would be a 7.5 win total. You take away the probabilities of them to win and lose to Michigan and USC. Those are the toughest games in their schedule outside of Oregon. You probably get a 7.5 win total by removing those 2 games. So now, between Minnesota, Oregon, Maryland, and Cal, they have to beat 2 of those teams. And they can probably afford to lose to 2 of them. I actually predict that they will do that. I think that Cal and Maryland are likely wins, or by likely, the most likely of the 4. Minnesota in the cold in November with cross-country travel, and I do think UCLA has a bigger coaching edge over California than they do Minnesota. I think it's going to be hard to travel to Minnesota in November and win that game, but it's very winnable. The only game on this schedule where I would say UCLA cannot win is Oregon on the road. They could have at least a sliver of a chance to beat anyone else. So they will flirt with the college football playoff in November. I agree with that. Now, how bold is it? It depends a little bit more on how Nico plays. If he hits his ceiling, say as a 3-1 TDI-INT ratio, 500 to 700 rushing yards, completes mid-high 60% of his passes, and has a good defense and rushing attack to pair with him, this team could win 9 games or even 10 and possibly be in the college football playoff. It's a big if, but it's possible. And if Zahir West, he's another key player in my opinion for this prediction to hit, he needs to translate his sack numbers, his pressure numbers, which are 7 sacks, 34 pressures. He needs to translate that to Big Ten play immediately and his 80.5 PFF grade. And I think he will. I'm pretty bullish on UCLA this year. That doesn't mean it's likely that they're going to flirt with the playoffs, because I have to, when I make these predictions, I basically think of betting odds or the opinions of people I trust, and I weigh those equally with my own opinion to balance things out. So, with this prediction, UCLA flirting with the college football playoff by rational Buckeye, I give it a 5 on the boldness scale. I think if your criteria is flirting with the playoffs, it's not that bold. It's bold, but it's not scorching hot. It's just, oh, okay, that's a cool, bold prediction. But you're not going to get anyone mad with that unless they're an absolute casual that doesn't even know or follow anything about the portal. UCLA making the playoffs, that's a bit different. I would probably put that at an 8 or higher. I'm 8.5 is the number that's coming to my mind of UCLA making the playoffs, maybe even a 9. Flirting versus making is different because that back-to-back stretch at the end with at Michigan and USC at home, they're likely to drop at least one, if not both of those games. So being in the conversation November, especially for them, is going to be much easier than making it. Unlike, say, in Iowa, where if Iowa's in the conversation in November, they're probably going to make it, because to be in the November conversation, they'd have to beat one of Michigan, Ohio State, Washington, and beat everyone else. And their final 2-game stretches at Illinois and Nebraska, where they'll be favored in both. So it's a unique situation with UCLA where I think they're going to overachieve. I have them going 8-4. Otherwise, it would be 9-3. But making the playoffs is unlikely. Flirting with it, though, getting media attention and publicity for being 8-2 entering that Michigan game, I don't think that's very unlikely. It is unlikely, statistically, due to the talent, due to the odds, due to the win total, but it's not all that bold. I can easily see that happen. All right, we're done. Thank you for watching. I will see you all very soon. Thank you for the views. Thank you for the subs. Thank you for the support. We'll be live tomorrow. I'll try to be live tomorrow at noon Eastern time. Today went much longer than I wanted to, but it is what it is. I think I went longer on these segments than I usually do. Tomorrow's show should only be about like hour 30 or 2 hours, maybe even less than that if I'm more on my A game. Today I was on, I'd say, my C game, C+ game. Anyway,